It is 1 o'clock, and I think we are about ready to get started with our meeting today. And before we do that, I will provide some administrative opening remarks. Good afternoon. It is 1 p.m. Eastern Time on the eastern side of the country. My name is Sue Shalal, and I am the designated federal officer for the Science Advisory Board, SAB Environmental Justice, Science and Analysis Review Panel. The panel was assembled to review EPA's draft revised technical guidance for assessing environmental justice and regulatory analysis, and to develop a self-initiated commentary outlining recommendations on advancing environmental justice science in rulemaking. The purpose of today's meeting, which will be held on 2 non-consecutive days, that is July 25th today and July 30th, is to listen to agency clarifying comments, listen to public comments, and review and finalize the panel's draft report on the EPA's EJ technical guidance and the panel's draft commentary on advancing EPA's EJ science in rulemaking. In addition to today's meeting, the review panel met virtually on March 21st, 2024, to listen to an overview of EPA's revised technical guidance and to learn more about the agency's EJ analyses in rulemaking. Then on April 3rd to the 5th, at an in-person meeting, the panel met to listen to additional agency presentations, listen to public comments, and deliberate on the questions. As always, all materials pertaining to this review, including the documents to be reviewed, agendas, charge questions, any public comments that are submitted, presentations by EPA representatives, and other documents as they are developed can be accessed on the SAB webpage associated with this SAB advisory activity. At this time, in my role as DFO, I would like to formally open today's public meeting. But before I continue with my administrative remarks, I wanted to inform everyone listening in today that the panel is meeting virtually via the Zoom video conferencing format. This meeting is also being broadcast live through both audio and YouTube video connections, and you can find the call-in information and a link to the video stream by going to the main SAB webpage at epa.gov/SAB and clicking on today's meeting date under the heading Meetings and Events. There you will find the link to the live stream as well as audio information. And now I'll continue with my administrative remarks. The SAB is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. The SAB is empowered by the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, or ERDA, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical underpinnings of EPA's decisions. FACA and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open session, where I, as a DFO, am present to ensure that requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that during public meetings, opportunities for oral and written comments are provided. There is a public comment period noted on the agenda for today's meeting, where members of the public can register in advance with the SAB staff office to make oral comments. At today's meeting, there are no registered speakers to present oral comments, and members of the public also have the opportunity to provide written comments throughout the advisory period and written comments are and were distributed to the panel members and posted on the SAB website. Minutes will also be prepared to summarize discussions and actions for all of the panel's meetings in accordance with the requirements of FACA and will be posted on the SAB website. The SAB consists of either regular government employees or special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions. And as government employees, all panel members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has reviewed the confidential financial disclosure forms submitted by panel members, along with other information related to their involvement in the development of materials related to this advisory activity. And EPA has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of lack of impartiality under ethics regulations specified in 5 CFR 2635 related to the topic of this meeting. And as a reminder, since some members of the public may be listening to this discussion via teleconference line, I would like to ask panel members to identify themselves when speaking. And before I turn the meeting over to Dr. Elian, the chair of the panel, I'd like to invite Mr. Tom Brennan, director of the Science Advisory Board Staff Office.
Oh, thanks, Sue. I really don't have too much to say other than I'm looking forward to the meeting and thank you for your public service. And I'm really looking forward to see how this draft comes together and moves forward toward a final product. So thank you.
Dr. Elian?
Yes, hello, everybody. I just want to first thank the members of the panel who have contributed to this project. It's been going on for a while, as well as the EPA personnel who help in so many ways. Today on the agenda, just to briefly summarize, Dr. Shalal mentioned that there were no public comments. That is on the schedule, or registered speakers. We did receive the written comments that were distributed. We'll hear from EPA, Dr. Ann Wolverton, some clarifying remarks on the draft report, that the SAB review of the technical guidance for assessing environmental justice and regulatory analysis. Then we have the opportunity as a group to discuss responses to the charge questions. We're scheduled to first do numbers 1 and 3, then take a short break and subsequently continue on 4 to 7. At the end of the day, we'll just go over what the next steps will be. And that's prior to the meeting being recessed by Dr. Shalal. The second meeting date, which is on the 30th, we'll reconvene if there are additional comments that need to be made and continued deliberation. We have the opportunity to discuss that again from the draft report, and then as well go on to the draft commentary with EPA clarifying remarks on the draft commentary provided by Dr. Christopher Frey. And finally, then we'll go to some closing remarks and next steps before, again, the meeting on the second half day will be adjourned by Dr. Shalal. So with that said, the actual times on the agenda may vary, and we're already doing that because there are no public comments. And we will start then with Dr. Wolverton with her presentation.
Before Dr. Wolverton begins, if I may, I'd like to go through the roster and to see how many of our members are online today. So I see you are here, Dr. Elian.
Yes, present.
Thank you. Dr. Abel?
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Annenberg?
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Honorio?
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Ock? I believe he was not able to make it today. Dr. Barakal? Okay, Dr. Chakraborty.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Collins.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Ann Fritz, I believe, is not able to join us today. Dr. Danae Hernandez Cortez.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Celine Hernandez Ruiz. Okay. Dr. Elena Irwin.
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Ari Lewis.
Present.
Thank you. Director Lisa Lomfight.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Musket. Okay, he may be able to join us later. Dr. Olmsted.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Osborne Jelks.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Patterson. Okay. Dr. Sad.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Janae Smith.
Present.
Thank you. And Dr. Lily Wu.
Present.
Thank you. Okay. Dr. Wolverton, please continue with your presentation. Thank you so much.
Should I share the slides directly or are they going to be presented?
I think they're being presented. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, you can advance the slide. So I wanted to begin by just thanking the panel for your very thoughtful, constructive review. It's clear that you took a lot of time to think about advice for improving the technical guidance, both in the near term and the longer term. So we really appreciate all the time and effort that you've put into this. There are quite a few statements throughout the draft report that broadly support the scientific and soundness and usefulness of the revisions that we've made. And so our goal is to stick to our original timeline and to release a final revised version by the end of 2024, which is the window at our sort of planning horizon at this point in the available window for release. Another reason for sticking to that timeline is that the 2016 version of the technical guidance remains in place until we finalize the revision. So my goal today is to offer, in light of that timeline and a lot of suggestions throughout the draft report, is to offer a few ideas for the way that you can improve our ability to operationalize that advice and also ensure that we're not missing priority recommendations that should be incorporated into that document in the near term, as well as informing the way that we prioritize both medium and longer term activities going forward. You can advance the slide. So my first suggestion is to think about tiering the recommendations to better identify what is important for us to address in the near term versus the longer term. And one way you could think about operationalizing this is to identify areas where there's consensus in the literature on best practices or methods that can be implemented in the near term versus those where perhaps there is a literature, but more thought needs to be done to develop an implementable method or a useful case study. That might be a medium-term bend. And then those areas where some additional research would actually be required in order to move forward in a particular topic area. And that would be the longer term. Another suggestion or request is there are some parts of the document already are very well sourced, but there are specific areas where data sources, references, or even more specificity in the suggestion would help us get started in, again, operationalizing a recommendation. So I just offer a few examples here. This is not a complete list, but one example is there's a couple of places in the document where you reference publicly available national level data on daytime exposures and activities. It would be really helpful if you could provide the specific data sets that you have in mind. There's a statement about characterizing uncertainty and variability in exposure and risk assessment. That's a very broad recommendation at this point. So understanding specifically what you have in mind that's not already reflected in the document would be really helpful. There's a discussion, a recommendation to add a discussion of limitations of maps and also ways to validate data, both of which seem very reasonable suggestions. If there are references that could get us started that you think provide a good overview or synthesis, that would be really helpful. And then the last example is just this suggestion include a matrix of cumulative stressors. Is not clear from that suggestion if you're thinking primarily about the illustration you pulled from the draft cumulative risk assessment planning and scoping document, or if you have something else in mind. So those sorts of things and connecting the dots in some of these places could really help.
I think you hit the mute button at some point and we can't hear you anymore.
Sorry about that. I keep trying to advance the slides. So instead I'm muting myself. Two other suggestions. One is if there's a way to streamline the recommendations on a specific topic or even a specific chapter to reduce redundancy, that would be really helpful. There's quite a bit of overlap right now between the responses to the charge questions 1 and 3 and the responses to later charge questions, mainly 5, 6, and 7. And while I think most of the time they're pretty consistent with each other, it's a little bit difficult to determine, because they do vary to some extent, if we're actually addressing all of the concerns and whether, you know, between those two different similar discussions, we've, you know, missed something. So that might be something else to think about. And then finally, there are some discussions in the document that are not particularly targeted to the technical guidance. Some of them speak to broader regulatory processes that would be beyond the scope of what an EPA analyst would do in the conduct of EJ analysis. And so while you are, of course, free to opine on the broader science issues, if you could clarify or at least think about the interface between these recommendations and the analytic context of an EJ analysis, that would be very helpful. Some examples that I noticed in my reading were things like the role of meaningful involvement, participatory and procedural justice, the tribal affiliation and tribal obligations discussion, and the role of states as co-regulators. In all three cases, in many cases, they're about the broader regulatory process and the way that these pieces fit in. So I'll end there. I, again, am very grateful for the time and effort you put into the report. We're already beginning to think through how we will incorporate many of your suggestions into the revision. And I look forward to the discussion today and the final report. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Wolverton. Those are helpful, and it's very nice to have you present that early in the meeting so we can be thinking about those things as we go through the charge questions and where some of your points can be addressed in our thoughts and deliberations. Are there any questions that people would like to ask Dr. Wolverton while we have her in the meeting?
I'll be sticking around all day, so if questions come up, feel free to ask. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, hearing none, and again, feel free either in the chat or raising hands or whatever mechanism, if there's anything that the EPA people can assist with. I know that they've been very helpful. So Dr. Shalal, I guess at this point we can go ahead and discuss the responses to the charge questions. And I think,
Yes.
Please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I think when we wrote some of these or the lead discussants, there were redundancies, and that was a little bit, I want to say on purpose in terms of addressing each charge question as an individual question. And so just keeping that in mind, it seems that redundancies can be helpful in some ways, but not where there are inconsistencies. So we can maybe think about how we want to address that if appropriate. So shall we start with the lead discussant then for charge question 1? And that would be Dr. Chakraborty. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marjorie. And it's good to have the feedback from the EPA regarding the comments and responses that we compiled a few months ago. And I appreciate those comments. And just a general comment I had that, based on my previous experience with other SAB review panels, the charge questions often tend to overlap. And since the way I think our responses were organized, I think I work with panel members who were assigned to question number 1. Obviously, we didn't have a clear sense of how the other responses were being written or organized. So obviously some amounts of overlap is likely at this stage. So I wasn't sure exactly how you would recommend, I guess it's a question for others, how we should go about reducing the amount of redundancy or overlap to making sure we don't repeat, I guess, certain comments and suggestions that appear elsewhere. I think that's kind of my issue in response to what we heard just now. And I also wanted to thank Anne, I guess, for pointing out that we do need to add data sources, references, and suggestions. I mean, there are things that I remember adding from comments that I received, I guess comments that I tried to organize and coordinate for those who send comments for question number 1 in terms of specific responses and data sources or just citations, that can obviously be used to do that. So I think that's reasonable and that can be done easily while we revise and edit the document. And I think there are certain issues about uncertainty and variability in risk assessment that was raised by panel members who are involved in question number 1 as well as others, and some of them require like a broader discussion with the entire group, so that also it's not too complicated. And hopefully in the next step, now that we're looking at now that we've looked at some of the other sections or the charge questions, but not all of us were involved in, I think they sound reasonable and that can be done fairly easily. And I'll let the others or I get involved in question number 1 to add more if I miss something. Thanks.
Do other members of charge question 1 want to add any thoughts to what Dr. Chakraborty mentioned? Dr. Abel.
Thank you. Well, first, I just want to thank Jay for his leadership on this opening section. And then my question is, do we want to get into our additional comments on this section, or you want us to add anything to help frame Jay's opening remarks?
I mean, Jay and Dr. Shalal can also add some thoughts. I mean, it seems like this is an opportunity to go ahead and work on some of these charge questions, so we can do that first, and then subsequently we can have the groups meeting outside of these 2-day meetings if necessary.
Okay. So my first comment on the response to charge question 1 is on page 10, line 35, there's a recommendation for bullet points. And I think there's an opportunity throughout the document to actually lead with bullet points there's a common principle in science communication that you should actually lead with results. And there are sections in here where you'll see it, the lead responses with bullet points, then followed by more in depth. And if anybody read the comments submitted by the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University, I think it is, that's what they did in their comments. They led with a kind of a high level bulleted list, and then it followed with more depth. And I think there's it would be very helpful in this letter report to the Administrator Regan that we have a consistent kind of format about how we lead with major bullets from the commentary and then follow with the more in-depth commentary. So that's my first comment on section 1 on how to also maybe respond to Dr. Wolverton's remarks about kind of tier 1 and tier 2. I think there might be a way to work in a team with Jay's leadership on further organizing this section with by tier 1 and tier 2 responses. So that's my first comment. I have some more, but I certainly want to give others on this team an opportunity to weigh in. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Wu.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Troy, and to build off some of the points that were made, I think for the iteration of responding to comments, and then also the framework that we have is in this revised draft document, it would be helpful to not only address that we need more references, but also notice the dynamics of these environmental justice concerns are literally very dynamic in the states, and so with the recognition that even yesterday there was a White House Environmental Justice Summit, the relationships that are needed to co-regulate and do risk assessments and the like in this space, I wonder if there's a way to not only address how the states can help inform the national picture, so to speak, for risk assessment and environmental justice concerns, and bridging those components, how to think about recognizing what Dr. Wolverton said about this is specifically for Office of Policy Economics, how to help you help us do this better job of informing each other, so that we with our individual experiences and subject matter or different levels of jurisdiction can better help with this guidance document for the federal level. Thank you.
Other comments or people that presumably everybody, the hand up. If I don't see somebody's hand, please feel free to let me know. And if anybody has suggestions on how to operationalize some of these suggestions, obviously the groups, for example, the charge question 1 group can sort through quite a bit of that for specific comments. Jay, I think that was an actual physical hand up.
Right. I just wanted to add, something we discussed in our previous meetings, that this question is a little bit different in terms of how the others are organized, in terms of others focusing on individual sections, and this question focusing on the entire document. So in a way, the way the charge question 1 is designed is kind of hard to avoid overlap, and some of it is deliberate because we did want to kind of highlight issues that our group thought may come up later, and it has. So I don't think that necessarily it's a bad thing. So because it's about clarity for the document as a whole and accuracy of various technical issues. So maybe we should treat this question a little bit different from the others because it does not focus on a specific or individual section. And I think panel members who responded to charge question 1, I think felt the same way, if I can speak on their behalf. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. Dr. Collins?
Yeah, it relates to what Jay said and what Troy was discussing too about redundancy too across and what Anne was talking about the redundancy in the responses on several points. And I agree with Jay there, since the questions overlap substantially. I think we can expect there to be some redundancy in our responses. I guess the question is, like, when there are discrepancies between the recommendations that address the same points, like that seems problematic to me. Or if we go about the process of tiering the responses the way Dr. Wolverton suggested, if we have like discrepant tiering of the same recommendations, I see that, I guess, as a potential issue. But I guess maybe Dr. Wolverton can clarify redundancy seems to me should be expected because there's overlap in the charge questions, but I think it's more of an issue of there being like discrepancies in these sort of same themes in the recommendations.
Yeah, so it would be really helpful, Dr. Wolverton, if you could address that issue.
Yeah, I think for chapter 1, again, because it's sort of an overarching summary, there's expected to be some overlap. And just looking for those areas of inconsistency makes a lot of sense. There are some of the other chapters, though. I think I recall chapter 3, which again is an overarching chapter, but there is some like very detailed discussion about things that are actually about chapter 5. And, maybe some moving things around a little bit, not necessarily eliminating entirely the overlap, but sort of thinking about where the relative emphasis should be would be helpful, and also might allow you to more easily identify if there are some inconsistencies, because when you consolidate this, it would make it apparent that maybe it is highlighting some places where you need to work out some potential. I didn't see anything that was like a large scale disagreement across anything. It was just that sometimes the discussions were a bit different, and the relative emphasis and the ultimate recommendation was slightly different in a few places. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Dr. Wolverton. Other comments about charge question 1 or general approach even? Just a quick comment, of course, in order to really go through it, it entails, as Jay sort of mentioned, really knowing what the whole final document is. And a lot of these were written prior to having that whole document. So it does provide an opportunity at this point in the process to be a little more aware of some of those issues of and more inconsistencies or different emphasis. So that's definitely something that we can try to address at this point. Other comments or suggestions? Charge question 1. Yes, Dr. Abel.
Yeah, well, I'll just try to take a stab at some responses I had to this first section, but also to the redundancy observation. And I think the redundancy is inherent in this kind of work and also probably helpful. But maybe I might suggest a near-term thing to address for the overall document, which the charge question 1 is about. It's not just about chapter 1, right? So I think a short-term action that we could recommend the EPA take is to consider another appendix on kind of, there are several places where maps or story maps or geography is part of the charge question responses and recommendations. So my thought is that EPA should consider perhaps another appendix summarizing some of the basic geography and cartographic aspects of environmental justice science. That seems like a short-term section that could be put together by some of us. And then in the longer term, the other redundancy I noticed throughout response chart questions deals with communicating with the public. Sometimes you know maps are really good, or story maps can be. I think a longer term project for the EPA as it thinks about improving environmental justice analysis and regulatory assessments is to think and discuss and maybe have some meetings on the field of science communication. I think there are some general things that are being communicated about science communication in other federal agencies and folks have been working with, and I think there's an opportunity in a longer term maybe for this part of EPA to be thinking and perhaps even investing in some outside expertise on helping this part of EJ think more about science communication. So those are two of my additional responses I wanted to share with the group. Again, recommendations, and I welcome constructive criticism of those two things.
I think a few members of charge question 1 may not be present on this call, so they may have other thoughts about this particular CQ1. But if I don't know, and Dr. Schall, Dr. Barakal, I believe, is not present, and I don't know if she's intending to come at all today.
I don't believe she is able to join us today.
Okay, and I think Dr. Muscat as well as you had mentioned. So I'm sure there are other thoughts and ideas that we're just not able to hear right now. Anybody else from the larger group? Dr. Wu?
Yes, thank you. Even though I'm not part of charge 1 question, I do have additional thoughts on that. I think part of the criticism to meaningful engagement is that in so many instances, particularly in the more current times, there is almost an over-reliance on putting just like outreach type communications, announcing in a Federal Register, announcing on a website, announcing in one-way communication styles, and not necessarily having a more active avenue of communicating back and forth. And for engagement, there's really that back and forth component that is needing to be built up. And so to Troy, your well-made point about story mapping, I think that unfortunately misses some of the populations such as indigenous tribes. And so I like to think of and what else. And so with that in mind, building out communications that are not necessarily so reliant on internet-based technologies so that we can reach and engage more communities that are needing addressing of environmental justice issues.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Wu. And absolutely, obviously, everybody on the panel should feel free to chime in regardless of whether you were assigned to this particular charge question. That's the reason to have these Zoom calls, so I appreciate that. Yes, Dr. Abel.
Yeah, thank you for that addendum, Lily. Very well said. I think there might be tribal liaisons in the regional offices that could be a focal point of those kind of activities that you're describing. But maybe let me just put my question to Dr. Wolverton. Right now, there are 2 appendices in the document. I think we have in our report a recommendation for a 3rd appendix describing in generic terms structural racism. So that's a 3rd appendix that would appear. So my recommendation would involve a 4th, maybe a 5th appendix. I mean, that's indicative of the problem here. How many appendices do we really want, or do we want to kind of condense it within the document? So, Dr. Wolverton, do you have any reaction to more appendices, less, or some kind of limit?
I would have to take it back to the writing team to figure out the best way of operationalizing a specific recommendation within the context of the guidance. Developing a separate appendix with a whole new set of information that's both complete and that we've kind of adequately gotten review of might be a heavy lift in the next couple of months, but figuring out ways to at least engage with that and address it as much as we're able. I think those kinds of recommendations are still very useful. The other thing I'll say is that we are initiating some activities outside of the technical guidance, which is necessarily broad because we're trying to give guidance over such a wide array of regulatory contexts and program offices. We are developing, for example, we just initiated development of a best practice guide for thinking through some of the very specific decision points one might face when doing proximity-based analysis, for example, because that's the most common approach that's taken in a relatively data poor environment across the different rules, and the degree of specificity that analysts have been asking for in terms of advice isn't well suited to this broad guidance, but it is definitely a need. So we're in the process of developing that in order to not have to wait till we develop, a new guidance and have something in the interim that would provide more of that specific advice. The point about science communication is also really well taken, and we're actually planning a series of workshops. And one of them, at the top, fortunately, is this idea of thinking about both visualizing results and also communicating them in both accurate and salient ways that are easy for the public to understand. So we recognize that that's definitely a gap where we need to engage some experts. So both points are very well taken. Yeah, I'll stop there. Hopefully that was a helpful response.
Thank you, Dr. Wolverton. Dr. Onuora, would you like to comment?
Yes, I'm going to add to the points that already been stated by Dr. Wu, Dr. Abel, and I know we did have a lot of discussion on meaningful engagement, and one of the things that kept reoccurring was that meaningful engagement, it's sometimes could be subjective and sometimes geared towards, as Dr. Wu stated, more on the outreach aspect, but not on the scientific aspect. And I believe that it was recommended there in the technical guide, or one of the recommendations is that there has to be a very succinct, short description of what meaningful engagement really truly means, whether you are engaged in research or outreach, and so that it's covering all the points of what the meaningful engagement truly is, and which is that the impacted communities are involved in all aspects of the, whether it's research or outreach, and that they're also met at where they are. Because some communities are very structured and enlightened, while some others are not. And so that was one of the things that we recommended, and I think, again, it was a reoccurring statement that somehow it be captured in the final draft, so that that meaningful engagement really has the impact and results that it's supposed to have. Thank you.
Other comments? Thank you, Dr. Wu. Yes, Dr. Abel, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for those about meaningful engagement. And since we're on that topic, I'll just build on the remarks, those remarks. There is a section on page 11. It's line 7 and 8. The current definition of environmental justice is meaningful involvement of all people and, quote, equal access, end quote, to decision-making processes, end quote. I would like to add, and Jay can review my edits in our next round, but I think I want to add language, and I just want to share with the panel that equal access actually rarely results in meaningful involvement, because if we just have equal access to everyone, those with more resources, money, expertise are going to actually have an unequal advantage in a supposedly neutral process. So I think that is a message about meaningful involvement that we can get into this section of the document that I think is important. Of all the social science research on public participation and a long history of criticizing the neutrality and equal access approach. Now, of course, the definition, the executive order defines environmental justice as equal access. So there is some limitation to what we can recommend that would encroach on that legal, the legal authority embedded within an executive order from the president. But nonetheless, I think that's something we could add in that section with some references and sources. So thank you.
Jay, go ahead.
Yeah, I had more of a procedural question in terms of how, I'm sure which will be discussed by Marjorie or Sue later, but in light of what Troy was saying in terms of how to add comments and suggestions on edits directly in the document, I think at this stage it will be a little bit easier if we allow those involved in not just this particular charge question, but others as well. If we could all add our edits or comments in the same document, and I'm sure you will discuss that later, Marjorie or Sue, but I was just curious what's the easiest way to, or more convenient way to do this in terms of the comments that are, being provided in this meeting. Thank you.
No, that's a very good point. I don't know, Dr. Schall, do you want to address that now, just so that people can keep it in mind as we progress through these 2-day meetings?
I'll be happy to create a SharePoint, document that everyone can add their comments to. My only concern would be if everyone is familiar with the, technology associated with it, or if they have access to that kind of, facility, but that's the only concern. Otherwise, you can all send me your comments and I'll go through and incorporate everything. So either way, it will work fine. We can get folks to either do it on one document where I share a single document with everyone. And if you're unable to use that, then I can certainly add you in, basically.
And it seems like the benefit of one document is that people could reference the recommendations, that are being made in one question and then see the updated version of recommendations being made in a different question where there could be inconsistencies. But I also appreciate that not everybody can access all these documents, and so we have to have other options.
Yeah, and also just to let everyone know that while some of our members were not able to join us today, I did ask for them to provide me any comments that they had ahead of time so that we could discuss them publicly. Because as you know, we are a FACA committee, and any suggestions or changes that are going to happen to our document should be discussed publicly. And had those individuals had any additional comments, we would have shared those with the entire panel and discussed them here today. And we have the opportunity to also have a further discussion next week on the 30th. So, you know, any changes, any ideas, any thoughts that you want to add to the report or even take away from the report should be discussed during our public meetings today and next week. So just wanted to add that before we continue with the discussion.
Yes, but thank you, Dr. Shalal. Director Lowenfeit, you had your hand up. Would you like to make some comments?
I just shared something in the chat. I appreciate the conversation. I think this is not easy. One size does not fit all in terms of Indigenous people, in terms of reservation, in terms of identity. We're all at different points at where our Indigenous knowledge is. Some still have their language, some don't. And that's, for us, that's an important component to Indigenous knowledge, is having the understanding and the use of that, what you might call data set, where you're able to use those words in that way and access that language. And so I think this is just a wildly important conversation. I just want to commend you all for doing this huge stretch. This is not easy, but I have been on many different committees, government and private, and I think this is the furthest I've seen people get in this difficult, I won't say difficult, just challenging topic. And I think what's important is having the conversation. So I appreciate that, and I'm very hopeful. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Lowenfeit. Appreciate your comments. Dr. Naruo, go ahead.
Yes, and this is my last comment on this subject. So Dr. Abel, and this is again piggybacking on what his last comment, and he read the definition that is in the books, equal access, and I think at the end of the day, it boils down to equality and equity. And with the equity in mind, rather than equality, it kind of addresses some of those gaps and disparities in under-resourced and over-resourced, and access to data and other things. So again, it's equity and equality, so addressing those two. Thank you.
So Dr. Chakraborty and other members of Charge Question 1, do you feel that you have some information and new comments or areas that you can use to revise Charge Question 1? And Director Lowenfeit, before anybody answers that question, your hand is up. I don't know if it's from, if you'd like to make some additional comments or suggestions.
So what I understand is I did make a comment in the chat, and I need to make that part of the discussion. So if that's all right with everybody, I can go ahead and just read that from the chat that I posted.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, my comment was, I want to discuss how inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in tribal communities is weighted. Given that there is a history of omission or even exclusion. Inclusion at this point would need to be heavily weighted to balance that history. In other words, to give it some emphasis that you would give other changes or additions is subject to the inclusion being lost within the weight and momentum of historical bias. There is also a tendency to resist questions and types of analysis that question initial assumptions and conditions. Basically, I have found that there's an urge to tinker with Western models when in fact they may need to be rethought at a more fundamental level. I recognize the difficulty in doing so, but as scientists, we cannot be fearful of questioning our base assumptions. This is why I generally tend to withhold my commentary, because from an Indigenous science perspective, many of the rules and presets they're based on would require deep examination and interrogation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, just to, for reading that comment, because not everybody has access to the chat. So it's very important that those thoughts get spoken and recorded.
In that spirit, I'll just actually read my chat response to Director Lonefi. Well put. And I think your comments probably fall into a long-term issue for EPA to address, like the Science Communication Initiative Dr. Wolverton shared. I think there is plenty of room and an opportunity to create an Indigenous knowledge group within EPA that really puts a long-term investment into exactly the kind of challenges you have shared with us today. So thank you.
Yes, we have Dr. Chakraborty and Director Lonefight.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments from Director Lonefight and also Troy. I just wanted to clarify whether we think charge question 1 would be the best place to incorporate those comments, or if they're applicable to some of the other charge questions as well. Just wanted to know what the others think, as well as Marjorie. Thanks.
Director Lonefight, your hand is up. Would you like to comment?
Yes, I think just to answer the previous comment, I think incorporating wherever they feel they need to be incorporated and it is fine. One of the things that I am going through, and it's people who are entities that are able to make that leap. It's seems like a long process to get to the point where we're able to be on the same page with Indigenous knowledge within research and science work, but it's critically important. I'm working with one of our armed forces and as well as MIT Lincoln Labs, and we will publish our model that we've used. It's taken us a while to get to the point where we are all on the same page, and that has been, they've been very involved with the language, the culture, coming and doing the important work on the land, etc. And now we have surpassed the normal timeline for doing research with other entities. So we not only caught up to the place where you would normally be in this sort of conversation and this sort of work, we've surpassed it. And that surprised them, didn't surprise me because it's happened with other groups. But I think that that's a risk. That's always a huge risk because I mean, how much time do we have? If this is, are we doing this on a more of a political agenda? So what do we have, 4 years? Sometimes it takes, about a year to move things forward. And then you really start doing some good science after about the second year. And so, and having that understanding, all being on the same page, not making, and people are afraid to make huge assumptions and leaps, and they're afraid to to connect things. And in the end, we've got to a good place. And this isn't just with this group, the group I'm working with, it's with others. It's that time. And so I think that's part of what, and I know that's hard to do in a document, but that's something that this will be over time. And so to have something in a document that says, and this is where we're at right now, this is where we expect to be in 2, 4, 6, 8 years down the road, and say, well, maybe that's not on the next person's agenda or whatever. But I think that I think there's a way to have that conversation and to include that in the document, that we can really do some of these things that not just for inclusion reasons, but it helps enrich the science, and it may help answer some of those questions, especially in terms of climate change, things that that we're working towards or working on right now, working towards different results or a richer data set. And that's for me in what I do in my science, and also being raised with my father, who is a scientist. He's also a traditional man, and he also, his first language for the first 5 years of his life was Hidatsa. And so that's where he came from and went into the sciences when it was something they told him, oh, you don't want to go and be a scientist, you want to be a gym teacher. And so these are the things that he has brought me through, and that I try to work with my students, my colleagues, my own children, etc., in doing that. And so I think that that sometimes can be a big dilemma, especially for an organization that is, I mean, we're in a really great place right now. Meeting Administrator Regan was an amazing, honor, but what does tomorrow look like? How do we put something in a document that can continue? And I don't know if we can, but I do hope there's a way to try. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Director Lowenfeit. Let me make a suggestion, going back a little bit to Dr. Chakraborty's comment about where some of this information might be useful. I know just in terms of time, and I certainly don't want to cut anybody off if other people would like to add some comments about charge question 1. And I apologize that I didn't read the charge questions. If we look at charge question 2, it does address meaningful involvement. Oh, thank you for sharing the screen on that. As we mentioned, the question 1 is really sort of overall about the technical guidance document, not addressing specific parts of it. It has the question about, are there topics that warrant more discussion? So it could be an opportunity to include some of the comments that have been made by members today as part of that second, fourth line of charge question 1. And then again, maybe this is a good segue to start looking at charge question 2 in terms of which says charge question chapter 2 discusses key definitions in the way in which meaningful involvement might inform analysis. Does this discussion provide sufficient background to analysts, and are there additional definitions that should be included? So as a group, I see, Troy, your hand is up now. When it's screen sharing, it's a little bit harder if there's other hands up, but would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I would like to answer Dr. Chakraborty's question about how much of this Indigenous knowledge challenge we incorporate in charge question 1's response versus other places. I think there's on page 12, lines 16 and 17, there's a reference to an article about how to integrate Indigenous knowledge into Western science. So I think we could talk about some of the broad contours of the challenge of Indigenous knowledge and its methodologies and epistemologies that are very different than Western science. But then I think charge question 7 is about long-term data gaps and methodological gaps. I think the agency, as Director Lonefight has generously described, is very challenged when it comes to Indigenous knowledge. And I would even suggest that as a science panel, we could recommend that this is a new kind of science panel that should be convened at the EPA. This science panel was first convened in 2016, and this is our second meeting. So we have been engaged in a long-term process with EPA on environmental justice science. And I think Indigenous knowledge systems need that level of attention and time to help the agency better help overcome some of the many challenges Director Lonefight has raised. And that's going to be my last comment on this, I promise. Thank you.
Yeah, those are excellent comments and suggestions. Dr. Wu, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. I agree with Director Lonefight and Dr. Abel in the sense that Western timelines and traditional knowledge and the history of what contributed to these inequities. I think to Dr. Anyoro's point about equity versus equality, they are also very different. So thinking about how these different chapters and different charge questions kind of go back and forth and iterate on it, I propose even including more figures in our revisions or suggestions, because in my mind, I think about systems cogs and the interlocking pieces and how different parts connect at different points as these pieces move back and forth. And so to the point that, Director Lonefight said about, political systems and timelines, government timelines and Indigenous, histories and the back and forth of like trust building is part of engagement. And so I really do support this idea of this working group, for lack of better words, Dr. Abel, if we're able to be more continuously helpful as these meetings 2016 and now are very far between. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. This is obviously a huge, I think the word challenge was used, and it's a great opportunity to go ahead and put these thoughts into an official report. And obviously things will be developing over time, but to document at this point, I think is really a great idea. Any other comments? Charge question 1. I don't hear any, and again, thank you for those who had put anything in the chat for going ahead and verbalizing them. Not everybody is able to see the chat, and everything is open to the public for these meetings, as Dr. Shalal mentioned. So is everybody okay then with moving on to charge question 2? And I think we could have the screen. That was very helpful, putting that question on the screen. Key definitions in the way in which meaningful involvement might inform analysis. Does this discussion, chapter 2, this is referencing, provide sufficient background to analysts? Are there additional definitions that should be included? So I will leave it to the lead discussant and just confirm if I have all that information, which I have way too many things open on my screen. Dr. Shalal, the lead discussant for two was,
I think Dr. Jelks.
okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. And what I have to say, I think is really brief. More so, I guess in response to the feedback that EPA has shared with us, as we just talked about in the last discussion, this idea of meaningful involvement really does flow through more than one of the charge questions. And so here it shows up again in charge question 2. There was a question about the definitions and whether or not there was more sort of needed there, and we didn't see any sort of direct response to the suggestions that we made there. So we'll just assume that those were points well taken, and that can be perhaps addressed pretty easily. I did note in the feedback from EPA with respect to sort of targeting the recommendations, there was a statement made that some of the recommendations, broadly speaking, I think just speak to the broader regulatory process beyond the conduct of the EJ analysis, and might be outside of the scope of the technical guidance. And what I just might say in reference to that feedback is that when we think about environmental justice, just generally speaking, I believe that it's appropriate to say that the process is just as important as the results. And so I do think that it was maybe somewhat challenging to try to just isolate what's happening as a part of the EJ analysis, because in some cases, the overall process really does inform even the data that you're using as a part of, conducting the EJ analysis. So we do kind of have to step back and look at the overall process to really look for those leverage points or opportunities for which, as the science is being conducted, we can ensure that environmental justice, is an outcome that we are trying to help to reach or to get to in the context of the regulatory process. I did see, so also in EPA's feedback, they mentioned, sort of maybe clarifying or kind of targeting a little bit more how we talk about the role of meaningful involvement, within the regulatory process. So perhaps we can, try to put a finer point on some things, but from my vantage point, we can't isolate the EJ analysis, or we can't really put environmental justice in a box to say that it has to be only something that we consider within the procedural steps of the analysis, because if the process overall has some holes or gaps in it, then it can, we can, still see inequitable outcomes if we're trying, even if we're trying to, within the steps of the analysis, to ensure that environmental justice is achieved. So I'll stop there and see if other panel members who were assigned to this charge question have other things to say. And then also, of course, anyone else on the panel, regardless of whether or not charge question 2 was the area that you were focusing on.
Thank you, Dr. Osborne-Jelks. Other comments by the individuals for this charge question? Again, I know a few people, Dr. Barakal, no, excuse me, Dr. Ock is not here today. The other comment I might make, thinking about the short term, medium term, and longer term, how that really relates to each question. And from our previous discussion, it seemed that there were some good thoughts about what could be for indigenous knowledge, even as an example, more on the short term, and then some other things may be on a longer term. So just keeping that in mind. Yes, Dr. Smith.
Yes, so I do have a couple of questions. I can't even remember at this point if this was if this was my charge question or I just comment on. But so one of the things that I was thinking about on meaningful involvement is that I'm looking back at the document now, and it's just even right after meaningful involvement, like there are bullets right behind it that's saying what they are, what is expected, but it's really not much detail. And so even and I think it was discussed in the comments, but like providing timely opportunities for members of the public to share information and concerns. So what's timely, right? Like what exactly does that mean? And there's no mention of like how that might vary from different community to community, and how that's not something that's really a standard, but how it should be assessed based on what are the factors we're looking at with the community that we're engaged with. Do we already have a relationship with that community? And so it just seems like to me, each of these different points could use like entire discussion by themselves, just giving more detail. Like the point, and it is mentioned in the text, but I do want to underscore like the fully considering public input provided as a part of this process. Like often, I know I've seen members of the public when they do comment and they say, hey, we came up here last time and commented and feel like none of our comments were actually considered or taken to heart, or like this decision was already made, or that it was not effective or any point. And so I think there should really be more consideration as to just being honest about what input the public does have, and being transparent about what could change, what might not change, and understanding that. And I would also say the fact that we have no public comment here, like just today, speaks to the fact that we are not reaching the appropriate, like I know when I speak with members of the community, they say like, oh, I had no idea about this. But the fact that we didn't have anyone to give public comment today, I think speaks to the fact that there are some issues with reaching the appropriate communities, because I know there are a lot of communities that care about this specific thing that we're discussing today. And I just honestly don't believe that no one has input on on this document besides us, honestly. So that's my kind of comment on meaningful involvement. Another thing that I think would be helpful when I was thinking about the key definitions, if I go back to look at specifically looking at overburdened and disadvantaged communities, there is a definition for overburdened communities, and there's some discussion about disadvantaged, but there are no specifics on like particularly what does this mean. So I think it would be really if there was just a box or something in there that just said, okay, these are communities that may be considered overburdened for this is not exhausted, but it could include, but not limited to, these particular communities. Like there's no the difference between an overburdened versus a disadvantaged community, why that may matter. I just think for people who aren't in this area or who don't do EJ analysis often, it might not be clear. And so I think if there could just be some more specifics around that, it would be helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And I think you actually were assigned to number 2, so you're doing a great job. Thank you for commenting.
So, but I just couldn't remember if I was ranking about.
Yes, Dr. Osborne-Jelks, your hand is up.
Yes, something Dr. Smith said reminded me of something. So when this was in our comments, and it's in the draft document, just this idea of kind of fully considering public comment, and as one sort of deliverable, as the rules are being developed. I think providing that feedback to people about what input was actually used, if there was some feedback that was deemed not to be able not to be something that was relative, to the issue at hand, like whatever the issues are, just kind of being responsive, to what was used and what wasn't used, and why it couldn't be, considered or used. I think that's part of what we, heard even back in April, and in some of the written comments that came from folks who looked at this charge question, this idea that, a lot of times people go and they spend their time, money, and other resources to provide public comment, but they don't get any feedback, no responsiveness, no real sense of, whether it was used or not, or whether, quite honestly, it was just a check the box sort of thing. We have to provide, the agency has to offer the opportunity for that input, but, sometimes people can't see their input at all in the decisions that are made. And so, being able to report back, to the public, what was done, what wasn't done, and perhaps, a little bit about, why certain things couldn't happen, might just, help people to have a little bit more faith in the process. And, could really improve chances of people actually engaging if they feel like the feedback is being used, or that, even if it was considered and couldn't ultimately be used, that that is communicated back to folks. The other thing is that, or maybe that was it. One other thing, though, that I did want to mention, as Dr. Elian, you were talking even about sort of the tiering approach that was presented earlier today. There was a lot of feedback that we had given with respect to charge question 2 around kind of the integration of qualitative and quantitative data, especially, in the context of, considering cumulative impacts. And so that might be, one of those things where I think everybody's still grappling with that and trying to figure it out. And I know that EPA has even sort of commissioned a National Academies of Science, working group to work on the I guess the broader topic of cumulative impacts and analysis. And so I just wanted to flag that, while it might be maybe easy to put that one in the box for the long term, I think it would be important to try to, figure out from at least a midterm perspective, what's out there, in the literature that we can sort of lean on now that could enhance, the next iteration of this technical guidance. So it may just require that we, kind of look at that in a little bit more detail to figure that out. But I don't think that that's something, even though we know that there are other, groups and folks within the agency who are also grappling, with this broader set of issues. I just would encourage us to synthesize what we do know, such that this next iteration of the technical guidance can reflect some movement along that front.
Yeah, great. That's an important point. Thank you, Dr. Osborne-Jeffs, for those comments. Dr. Wu, and then Dr. Collins.
Yes, thank you. I feel I'm going to be kind of a broken record, but in the spirit of redundancy here, I really appreciate Jeannie, Dr. Smith's points, and then also Dr. Jux, your points about, the living state of the dynamics here with the definitions being important. So at least to address that point about the use of overburdened community and disadvantaged community. In California, we have state level regulation that literally addresses communities that are overburdened as disadvantaged. So to the point that for charge question 2 about key definitions, I think it's a great idea to be very explicit with the nuances that are similar and overlapping, but yet different in the way that different states might have slightly different definitions, but mean very similar things. And then to the point of, that kind of systems iteration back and forth, I think that for meaningful engagement and communities building trust with government agencies to address the community's issues, I think for that meaningful engagement component of it, there needs to be maybe some language maybe in the best practices or like ideas of where we are to improve is not only providing access in terms of like, this is going to happen, at what point of day does it happen? So clearly to that comment about only one public comment was submitted here and we're meeting in the daytime. So people have jobs. And so in the evening hours when some community meetings are happening, you know, I experience pushback as well about like, well, you're being paid or you're not being paid. And so, yeah, to get meaningful engagement and full kind of participation of community members or community-based organization, there is an opportunity cost that they have to participate. So I think to a certain extent, if we're able to address that part of it, especially as it intersects with environmental justice, it's important to talk about budgeting for community meetings and what it means to have meaningful participation and providing access to people to attend those meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Dr. Collins?
Yeah, the discussion has been great with the meaningful involvement, engagement, and public community participation. Just one observation when I look at the recommendations for charge question 2, I don't think meaningful involvement's even, that phrase even occurs in there. So I think it may be something to reflect on with the overall, we were talking about the details of what we're going to put in the narrative, but I don't think that's actually even in the recommendations. I was just looking through the documents. So I don't know if we should reflect, if charge question 2, folks should maybe reflect on how that, there are things that connect with that theme, but I don't think it's really encapsulated in those recommendations probably as well as we want it to be. Mm-hmm. Just my thought when I look at those 4 recommendations.
And I would just add in some ways that those synthesized recommendations are really critical. So even looking at them all for each charge question and confirming that the recommendations are clear and to Tim's point, really reflective of what the most important things this committee has discussed or thinks about are very well illustrated in those recommendations and the bullets, getting back to sort of the importance of the bullets. Dr. Nehru, your hand is up. I think you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. I said I'm piggybacking on what was said, I believe it was Dr. Smith, talked about the absence of public comments on this very critical issue. And I think that EPA as an agency, and I did mention this in a face-to-face meeting, they're doing a great job on addressing this issue. Dr. Lonefight also mentioned that it's a very difficult issue to talk about when it comes to environmental justice. And but there has to be a better way for the public to know how much effort is being put into addressing this and incorporated into the policy making and decision making, and so that the public will be more invested in making their comments. A lot of times when I talk to them on the community level, they kind of have this notion of EPA not doing enough, and they have to be more communication. I don't know how that's going to happen to let them know what's being done. And especially currently, there's a lot of effort going into addressing environmental justice. And I can see the impact even at the community level, but that communication, it's not quite there yet. And it has to be communicated and so let the public know. And so that it can have more involvement in what is going on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Ms. Lewis?
Yes, hi. Sorry, I think my camera's not working for some reason. This is all really important about the community engagement. I just think though for this document, which is dealing with federal regulations on a national level. As we start making these recommendations, we're really going to have to try to make it specific about how to deal with community engagement for a regulation that, you know, may affect the entire country and many different communities. So how to target that, like, I think adds an extra layer of challenge on it. You know, it's kind of difficult enough, even if it's like a specific facilities affecting a specific community, but this document is focused on sort of national regulations that affect many communities.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Absolutely true. And, you know, using examples can be effective, but also understanding your point that these documents can't address everything, but it gives us an opportunity to, in a bulleted fashion, make recommendations that we think are specific answers also to the EPA questions about gaps and things like that. So, but it is a challenge.
Yeah, I think we should make the recommendation, just keeping it in mind about that sort of that layer is in there as well.
Yes, absolutely. Other comments for the charge question 2? Hearing none, I think we've sort of allocated about 30 minutes per charge question for the 1 through 3. And so maybe at this point, then we can go to charge question 3. Dr. Saad is the lead, and thank you very much for projecting that on the screen for everybody, which I'll read out because I know not everybody has access to the visual. Are the 5 overall recommendations and list of best practices in Chapter 3 reflective of sound scientific principles in the technical literature? Are there any analytic recommendations that should be added or removed? Dr. Saad, I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you. I apologize. I'm ill and so not
No.
going at full speed, but I thought that this section of the draft, I was happy with it. I thought that it addressed the charge question requests on the recommendations and best practices, and also offered detail on some analytical approaches and specifics. I was really interested in and appreciate Dr. Wolverton's observation about redundancy and overlap in the draft overall. And she called out that there were those overlaps and redundancies between chapters 3 and 5. And I'm happy to work on rewriting in order to eliminate those or address those. And I'm wondering if perhaps EPA could flag those specifically in the draft so that we can efficiently and completely address them. And also her mention of a request for expanded explanation on a couple of items in chapter 3 on the limitations of maps and so forth. Again, I'm happy to work on the rewrite for that in order to provide that. So those are my comments, but I'm overall happy with the draft. And I will say that the recommendations for this charge question really seem to me to be all short-term recommendations. There's no reason that they can't be addressed and implemented right away. And so I don't think any subdivision there is necessary. I'm wondering now if any other panel members for charge question 3 would like to comment.
Yes, Dr. Collins.
I don't have much to say. I just agree with Dr. I agree with Dr. Saad. It sounded like I said disagree, but yeah, no, I agree with Dr. Saad that I think those are all short term. They're all pretty nutsy boltsy. The recommendations, things that could be implemented in the revision pretty in a straightforward way.
And again, I think Dr. Muscat's not present today. Dr. Hernandez Cortez and Dr. Patterson, I'm not sure is able to attend.
Hi, I couldn't find the raise hand in my new Zoom update, so I'll
Perfect.
just jump in. I agree with Dr. Saad. I think that this is a very complete, I really like the draft. I think it's very complete. Perhaps we need to add some references especially for the selection of the geographic unit. So I can work on that, Dr. Saad, if you agree. Perhaps the only paragraph to clarify, and it's related to the NYU comment that was submitted earlier, is the economic challenges for population groups and the increased costs and analyzing how this affects groups of concerns. I think that we could try seeing if the comments related from the NYU could be relevant here. So that was my only comment. I think that we could probably incorporate or see the relevance of those concerns in this paragraph. But other than that, if we could get some more clarification, I agree that getting a little bit more clarification in how not to be redundant between charge 3 and 5 will be relevant, especially because I was in both charge questions, so perhaps it was my fault. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Hernandez Cortez. Dr. Collins, go ahead. Your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about the NYU. They provided, those are really thorough comments they were provided, and they were good, some of them. I guess I'd raise the question is, what do people think about the point in particular about the monetization of everything? You know, for me, I guess that connects with the cost benefits and that Dr. Hernandez Cortez was just discussing, but it's a pretty big ask, I guess, right? To try to reduce all outputs or all results or findings in monetary value terms. I'd be curious to hear what others thought about that if you were able to read it.
Yes, Dr. Abel.
Yeah, thank you for asking the question, Dr. Collins. I too have, I read the comments. I thought they were well structured. I think they give us some ways to structure the overall document, leading with some bulleted summary points. But you know, there's quite a rich body of scholarship criticizing the limits of monetization of especially environmental benefits versus cost. It's much easier to, relatively speaking, quantify cost and benefits. So I have those reservations about trying to monetize everything. However, it can be a very helpful analytical exercise in some cases, and in other cases it's not. And I think it's also, we have heard a perspective from Director Lonefight, monetizing everything is not would not be consistent with many indigenous knowledge systems. So I think we have to, I don't know what our role is in responding to that public response, that public input. Perhaps Dr. Shalal can clarify that for us, but that's my broad, you know, they will stand as they are in the record, and how we are to address them is a question, I guess, maybe Dr. Shalal or Dr. Alion, you could clarify.
Actually, if you want, I can try to clarify that because it's outside of the SAB process. So we put the document out for public comment. We also did tribal outreach, and we did a formal consultation. So as the writers of the document, we're responsible for taking all of the public comments into consideration, as well as the tribal feedback we got, and thinking about ways to modify the document. that doesn't preclude you from reading them and thinking whether there are particular things that you see in the public comments that you want to lift up in your own advice. But each of those are separate bins that we will take into account as we're revising the document. So there's no requirement on your part to distill and think through the public comments that were separately submitted through the public review process.
Dr. Abel, does that answer your question, or do you have any follow-up questions for
No.
Dr. Wolverton?
I think Dr. Wolverton did answer the question. So if we want to respond as an individual, we can write a separate letter on our would that be the way to respond to that?
So just to add to what Anne has already said, and Anne, you're on mute if you're trying to talk right now.
Go ahead, and I can follow up if there's anything.
Yeah. So Anne is correct. The comments actually came to the docket for the agency to consider when they're revising their document. But it's also, I guess, on one part, advice to the panel to add to their own comments if you agree with what they've said, and if you want to also encourage the agency to go in a particular direction, you are free to include some of that advice into our report to the agency. We do not respond directly to public comments. That is a process that the agency undertakes whenever they're putting out a new guidance or a regulation or an assessment where there is a public comment period. The agency will respond directly to those public comments, letting people know how they were incorporated or why they were not incorporated. And so that's how we deal with it within the SAB. So you are free to acknowledge and include any of that advice that is being offered through the public comments. And there is no direct response back to the public commenter.
Yeah, that's right. I would just say that the requirements for response to comment are slightly different within regulatory context, where there's actually like a physical document that goes through comment by comment and responds about what was taken, what was not, and why. There's not a direct responsibility for that for these sorts of documents that are not where there's no mandate for putting it out for public comment, but we will consider all of the comments that we received in tandem and think about and be documenting what we're taking in and when we're not taking something. That is not true with regard to the tribal consultation, which has a separate government to government process. There, if we've received written or verbal comments, we are through the tribal consultation process, we have a obligation to respond after this process has completed, and so we built that into our plan. And in fact, some of the tribal consultations that happened that aren't reflected directly in the docket because they were done through the tribal consultation, there is information available through EPA's tribal system called TCOTS on some of that outreach and what we heard as well. But yeah, so we'll be taking care of that.
And just quickly, Tom Brennan, I think you are not on mute. I don't know if you wanted to add anything or not.
I'm sorry. I thought it was muted.
Yeah.
I think it's going great listening and enjoying. Nothing to add at this point, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. There was a little bit of background information.
Yeah, that was me.
Okay, great. I thought so. Dr. Olmsted and then Director Lone Fight.
Yeah, I appreciated Dr. Wolverton's and Dr. Shalal's clarifications of those points about monetizing, especially the benefit side. I just would add that, there's almost a point of clarification that, these are guidelines for EJ analysis, and all of the economically significant rules, with those come a major, kind of regulatory impact analysis that it's its own benefit cost analysis. And there's a separate set of guidelines for economic analysis that the agency has to follow for those practices, including things like where benefits can't be monetized or haven't been monetized. At least you're listing, kind of in a qualitative way, the pieces, right, of the puzzle that haven't been assigned those dollar signs. And I think the Institute for Policy Integrity's comment slightly differently, which is to say, where we have those estimates of benefits in the EJ analysis, right, you don't need to stop short of going all the way to the dollars, right, and just look at differences in exposure or something like that. But you could, that it would be preferable to take that all the way to the monetization where that's occurred. Rather, I didn't read it as, right, the EJ analysis should separately be trying to estimate, kind of monetized benefits of these things. Because I agree with stuff that other folks have said, that first of all, there are many important pieces here, in the EJ analysis that we wouldn't want to monetize or that couldn't be monetized. And additionally, kind of my own view is that expecting, right, the EJ analysis to go beyond what's already been monetized in an existing benefit cost analysis, I think is much too heavy a lift for the agency. And I'd rather see the kind of existing principles and guidelines for that practice followed, right, as a kind of separate matter, and then take that information and use it in the EJ analysis to the extent possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Olmsted. Director Lowenfeit, go ahead.
I just need to take a closer look at the meaningful engagement that we had with, or that was had with tribes. And so I apologize that I'm not up to speed on that, but I will take a look at that, and then I'll email maybe any comments that I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just again, in case folks have forgotten about the raising the hand, there's the react button with a little heart over it down at the bottom of the screen, and so you can find the raised hand once you click on that. But if some people have comments and they'd like to make, I don't know, Dr. Hernandez, Dr. Wilbur, Ann, go ahead, Dr.
I just wanted to mention one other thing that might be useful to the panel as you're crafting your response specifically with regard to meaningful engagement, that I think some people are aware of, but there's a separate meaningful involvement policy that was in the process of being revised and was also put out for public comment around the same time that this document was put out for public comment. And the release date of that is going to be sort of a similar trajectory. So we're coordinating with them very closely to be able to reflect that fully in basically in places where we go well beyond guidance specifically to the audience for this document of analysts. We'll probably in most cases be trying to rely on that policy and that document so that we're consistent. I've wanted to let folks know, having seen a recent draft of it that's still internal, that it does include a lot of detailed best practices and examples and things that I think will prove very, very helpful. And again, it's not, it's by no means wasted effort to opine on that broader on the broader topic, but I did want to let you know that there is this separate document that's under development now that will be kind of a companion or run alongside this. It's broader than just the regulatory process. It's about meaningful engagement broadly for all of EPA's activities, but it is in the process of being developed.
Actually, could I just ask Dr. Wilverton, how much, just as an example, public comments did you receive on that? I know it's outside this
guidance. I can try
to
look it up in the docket and let you know. I'm not part of that specific development process, but let me look it up and then I'll let you know when I have that information.
Just curiosity.
Yeah, I'll look it up now.
Are there other comments people would like to make? Dr. Smith?
I just had a question because it was mentioned earlier about looking through our document and for potential places where there are discrepancies. And so I was just wondering, if there was a way to think about potential discrepancies, and I know it might kind of be outside of the scope, but between what we are thinking about for meaningful involvement and what might actually be in that document. And I don't know if that would be something be outside of the scope of what we are doing, or we don't have a final copy of that document, but I'm just interested to know if there are places where, is there anywhere where we're seeing things that are popping up that may not be in line that we should reconsider?
I think that may be a Dr. Wolverton question because she's the one who has information about that other project.
I mean, I can share the link with you all for the version that was put out as a draft for public comment. So you can look at that. I'm not at liberty to share the current internal draft, of course. I have the sense that the policy has changed quite a bit in response to public comments, and that it's been expanded quite a bit to try to include more detailed best practices. So you wouldn't necessarily have access to that information, but I can share what was circulated publicly. And it looks like there are about 52 comments in the docket on the meaningful involvement policy. And just to put it in perspective, I think we got something like 32 or something on this technical guidance document. I believe, but I can check this as well, that they also did a separate tribal outreach, but I can confirm that.
Right.
And if you could send me the link, I'll share it with everyone, as well as the docket number.
Yeah, I can do that.
Thanks.
Right, thank you. Director Lone Fight?
Yeah, so there are so many tribes, so many in terms of finding meaningful engagement, that's boy, that's a packed statement, isn't it? Meaningful engagement. And so what does tend to happen is, well, there are so many tribes. How can you possibly comment from every one of them? That's difficult. I would just make a suggestion to this group, and I think I have before, but don't forget the National Congress of American Indians. They have a very elaborate website. They do engage with tribes. That's a great way to disseminate information and to give a call to different things that are needing tribal comment. And there's usually a person who's assigned from the tribe to take a look at that and make sure that we're checking that, as well as we will share things with them. So just a heads up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Director Lone Fight. That seems like an important piece of information to add to a document as a specific suggestion. Any other comments related to charge question 3? If not, the agenda, just to recap, has a break between 3 and 3:10. And then we would start with the discussion for charge question number 4. So if there are no comments, maybe we could do a 10-minute break from 2:55 to 3:05 and come back at 3:05 to continue our discussion. I really appreciate everybody's involvement and comments. And I think we can start the clock. There we go, right? Before I even had it out of my mouth. So thank you very much. See you back in 10 minutes and 48 seconds.
Thank you.
Hi, Sue. I think your break is officially over at this point.
Yes, it is. We're ready to
So-
get started. I do believe Dr. Wu was assigned to charge question 4, but I think she's still not back, or maybe she is.
I am audio only. I am not awake. Sorry, not at my computer, but I should be in about 10 minutes. But I am still listening in.
Okay, how would we like to proceed? Doctor, would you like to give comments now or have others in your group start us off?
I think it would be helpful if others in my group could start us off, and then I can get back to my computer in the next 10 minutes.
Okay, that sounds fine. Thank you for sharing the screen. And so we're on charge question 4, and I will just comment that Ms. Fritz, who was assigned to this question, is not able to join us today. So, but I believe that the other 3 members are here, which is Ms. Lewis, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Anuoro. So charge question 4 for the EJ contributors and drivers states Chapter 4 provides a brief overview of the contributors and drivers of greater risks and health effects from environmental stressors for population groups of concern. Does the discussion of contributors and drivers adequately reflect the state of the literature? Is it clear and technically accurate? So I'll ask those individuals who were assigned to this question. Would somebody like to volunteer to start us off?
I can say something.
Okay, thank you.
I just, reviewed it the other day. There's a lot more in there than there was the first time, which is great. I do think this section, when we get to the end, we have these like bullet points at the end, which I do think kind of capture what's in there. And but when I read through the text, it seems like we make a lot of the same points like over and over again in different ways. So I'm almost thinking, and I can help with this, or Dr. Wu can, whoever, if she wants to delegate it to me, that since the bullet points at the end, I do think kind of capture the main points. Maybe we can organize them under each bullet point can have be a section heading, and then we can kind of go through the whole thing and kind of pull out the parts that support that bullet point. So it's more of an organizational thing. But I think there's a lot of content in there. I think, most of it's, on target. So it would be a matter of just organizing it, I think, a little bit better.
So this is Dr. Florence Anuoro.
Yes,
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm using my phone now because I lost connection with my my laptop. So Dr. Wu actually did a very wonderful job compiling all the comments, and the comments that were addressed by the team and even others during our in-person meeting was captured in there. So I think it's well written, and I don't really have any additional comments to make.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
I'll just say I agree with that recommendation. The final bullet points do summarize it pretty well, and we did in quite a few places. There are things that were already discussed. So the things about defining specific terms, which was discussed earlier in the number 2 charge question. We've talked a bit about meaningful involvement. That was another charge question. So I think we could go through and kind of reorder this. One thing that I do think that was really that I thought was really important was that just the suggestion for a clear and specific framework for EJ analysis. I think there are some suggestions in there, or some things that are general, and while it is a need to keep the analysis general and be flexible for anyone, as different types of analysis have different needs and people are able to do different things. It seems like it might be a little bit too open in that way, and that might impact the science that we get. And so we don't want people producing what they believe is adequate EJ analysis, and then that science is not able to be utilized. So I think I wanted to underscore that need for maybe a more specific, detailed framework. But I do agree with the way that it could be rewritten or reorganized in our response. And I can assist with that also.
Great, really appreciate also the offers to go, implement, organize, and actually take care of some of these issues, because really you have such a good understanding and knowledge base. So thank you for the folks who are stepping up in that way. Other comments from other members of the group? And I'm just going to quickly mention, Tom Brennan, you're not muted again. There's a little bit of background noise. I didn't know if you had a comment you'd like to make.
I'm so sorry. I'm just working and listening, and I'm sorry about that.
No problem. I just don't want to miss your comment and make sure that we're all on the same page. Anybody, other folks who would like to provide a comment before Dr. Wu gets back to her computer?
Sorry, I unmuted myself. Before I get back to my computer, I appreciate the comments of my fellow panelists who have commented already. I think to Dr. Smith's points, I would like to just build on that too, with the back and forth. Chapter 2 really does set up the stage with the definitions that Chapter 4 speaks on. And then to further clarify, I think maybe even a nested approach about specific words like intrinsic and extrinsic as they fit into the current chapter, and then with the mention on cumulative impacts and how chemical and non-chemical stressors even can be considered within intrinsic and extrinsic factors that contribute and drive to EJ issues. I think some of the reorganization and further elaboration is well warranted. So to my fellow co-panelists, I appreciate the comments and help.
And Dr. Wu, just feel free to delegate as needed. If we don't want to put that all on you. So.
I think the shared document that Dr. Shalal will share with all of us will be the key implementing instrument. Thank you.
And I guess I had one, oh, Dr. Troy, Dr. Abel, sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. And good work, Dr. Wu, on this section. It brings me back to my initial commentary about maybe having a consistent structure where we could lead with bullet points in each of these responses and then followed by the more in-depth. So I think moving that up, and in general, doing that across all of our responses might be a good reorganization of this. But I also am remembering Dr. Wu's plea for more graphics. And one that comes in mind is a 2002 publication that I think Dr. Sad was on, that includes a very nice figure on the political economy of environmental inequality. And I think that would be a nicely placed graphic. And if, since Dr. Sad is here today, I don't know if that is something you would support or not, but that came to my mind when I thought about this section. Thank you.
Troy, I agree with you. I think that might be a good addition.
Right. Well, that's an easy one to incorporate and to provide to the group. Thank you for the suggestion. I guess I would have one question about opportunity to think about sort of that short-term, midterm, or longer-term bullets in this particular, the recommendations. It's-
Dr. Elion, you're on mute if you were saying something.
Thank you. I was actually sneezing. I didn't want the whole group to have to go through that with me. But I guess I was just thinking in my mind, looking at the recommendations on page 32 and 33 about some of them do seem to be more short-term and with additional elaboration, I think would really help EPA. And then a few are more medium-term, and I didn't know what others thought about that.
Do you mind providing additional, could you elaborate on what you think of? Because when you made that statement, I scanned through and I thought, oh, they all look short term, like they should all be. I think these are all immediate, and I think that is my personal framework of we need this now, but
Yeah.
the specific ones that stood out to you is
I guess some of, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of them are short term. And I think words like emphasizing or recognizing, for example, it can be short term. I guess how do you operationalize that in a way that that EPA to come out to on the other end where it's what EPA is actually doing, what maybe this group or thinks is the important parts of some of those bullets. In some ways, even, defining the terms is for sure short-term in my mind. So so those were not the bullets that I was thinking about, but I guess emphasizing the role of climate change. I guess I just was a little bit unclear how that seems a little more of a medium term and more specificity about that. If there were more specifics included in that bullet, those could be short term in my mind, but then some others, it's a broader statement.
Thanks.
Yes, Dr. Wu, I take it looks like you're back in a
Yes, I'm back.
physical location.
Yes. Thank you. I think for, the discussion right there about the bullet point about climate change and cumulative exposures, I actually see that as a medium to long-term kind of bullet point, because cumulative exposures, when we're trying to consider the chemical and non-chemical stressors, that non-chemical stressors is like this right now black box of like, what does that mean? It can mean anything from the built environment to access to healthcare, to education and things like that. So I think that understanding exposure as humans live in different environments, whether rural or urban or anything else in between, it is very hard to quantify what exposure is, especially in that paradigm of lived experience. And so until the qualitative understanding of how things play out really can be included in a cumulative impacts assessment, I think that that's a long-term challenge. But building into that cumulative impacts assessment, the short term that I see as attainable is building that relationship with communities to understand, what their lived experience stressors are. And so the piecemeal part is, I think, the meaningful engagement with communities to build out to the long term. How do we quantify and qualify what those lived experiences are into a cumulative impacts assessment?
And so I guess one recommendation I might make in other panel, the recommendations in the bullets were actually listed under, tier 1, short term, tier 2, medium, and tier 3, longer term. And I don't know how people feel about that for this document. But I think it's an easy way for the EPA to really hone in on that idea about some of the things you were specifically saying, Dr. Wu, that are more complex pretty easily. Other comments? And Dr. Wu, I know you were listening on the phone to some of the other comments that were made, but I don't know if you had additional thoughts that you wanted to add for this charge question number 4.
I think to the recommendation about utilizing local data and indigenous knowledge, I would appreciate any help from Dr. Lowenflight or Director Lowenflight or others that feel they can contribute in meaningful ways with that, because it's not my specialty.
Yes, Director Lowenflight, go ahead.
Absolutely. That's one of my research areas, finishing up my PhD, which I think will probably take me the rest of my life. So I definitely would like to do that. What I'm doing is a lot of work in that area with different government entities and working with our nation. And so I think that that might help inform what we're doing here. So happy to help.
Dr. Wu, this is Florence. I would also send you, there were a couple of articles that I had mentioned in the SAB report that we did last year, referencing the mobile units and how its impact on communities of disadvantaged communities. So I can send that so that you see how you can incorporate it as well.
That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Any other comments for charge question 4 that people would like to add? And Director Lowenflight, your hand is still up, but I'm not sure if that's from your previous comment or you'd like to add something else. Okay, it just went down, so we're all good there. So if everybody's fine with the charge question 4, we can move then to charge question 5. Dr. Annenberg is the lead for that question. And I think for this question, Ted Ock is not here today. And I think the other people assigned to that question are here. So charge question 5, in chapter 5, are there additional technical considerations that should be enumerated to start integrating EJ considerations into the planning phase of human health risk assessments, HHRA? Do the scoping questions in sections 5.3.2 adequately identify opportunities for incorporating environmental justice into an HHRA? Dr. Annenberg, would you like to start us off?
Yes. Hey, everyone. So for charge question 5, I think here I have a few comments. It is shaping up really nicely. EPA's comments at the beginning of this call were quite useful in finding some areas of overlap with other charge questions. So the first thing I wanted to point out is we have a paragraph in the response to this charge question about defining the purpose of the EJ analysis. And I know that other charge questions also tackle this. In particular, I'm thinking charge question 3 might be an area where it might actually be more appropriate for this discussion to happen in charge question 3, because I think that's kind of like the framing of the analysis portion of the report. So I might suggest that we take this paragraph that's here in charge question 5. It starts at the top of page 34. And we add it, reconcile it, condense it with what's currently in the response for charge question 3. My second comment is in the next paragraph, actually, on page 34, which talks about other documents that could be referenced in this EJ technical guidance. The EJ Science Data and Research Plan was just released today, or possibly yesterday, the event for its release was today. So that is out now, and I don't know, you know, this, I'm sure this happens routinely with SAB reports where during the course of our report, we've deliberated, we've written something, and then a new governmental document comes out that changes everything. I'm not saying this changes everything, but I guess the question is, how much should we invest the time to read that report, reconcile it with what we've written, or should we just recommend that this EJ technical guidance refer to that that new document, the Environmental Justice Science Data and Research Plan, which comes from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. There's another point of overlap on page 35 about meaningful engagement. And so we're returning to that same topic of meaningful engagement. So here I'm just flagging, I don't know exactly where in our report this should live, if it lives in one place, or we want to create like a cross-cutting box or something like that for a topic like this that exists at the different stages of the technical guidance. But here we have a whole paragraph on meaningful engagement that could be overlapping with other sections. I don't have much to say about the rest of our draft here. I'll just go to the recommendations. Most of these, I believe, are short-term. The only one that I had a question about is the cumulative risk assessment and cumulative impacts analysis. That might possibly be medium or long-term. I'm interested in what others have to say about this. There are cumulative impacts guidance documents being written as we speak. There's a National Academies study on it. And I think the question is, how does it get incorporated into regular EPA regulatory documents specifically that are often focused on one single risk factor because of the legal framework that the regulation is so I'm not sure about whether or not I would term that one medium or long. That's all I have.
Thank you, Dr. Anna Bergen. Mr. Rodney, you have your hand up, so I think you probably have something to add.
Instead of typing and being distracting, I have something I'd like to say. So, it's not unusual during this stage of a review that additional information is identified. Dr. Annenberg, the way you phrased it, it almost sounded like all or nothing, like should we dig in or not? Yeah, and what I would say is I think there's probably a hybrid level where you can add some value without derailing the whole project. But if you've identified a good source of information that's new that should be in play in this document and review as a reference, then I encourage you to pursue it.
We can certainly do that. Thank you, Tom. It applies to all of the charge questions, I would think, not just charge question 5. And before I opine further, maybe Dr. Wolverton has something important to say.
I don't know how important it is, but I did want to mention that we had a lot of opportunity for input into that document that was released from OSDP. So you can also read it as kind of a distillation of what was to some extent bottoms, like there was a data call and requests for things that we thought should be prioritized and put into that document. And so it's not like a top-down document. It's what are we hearing from the agencies that where those data and science needs really are where those gaps exist and what we think are priorities. So you can also view it as a reflection of what the agency themselves identified, including in the rulemaking space. So if there are particular things that you want to lift up from that document, great. Or you think, direction to us to look at it and cross-reference it is fine too, whatever you want to do. But I just wanted to let you know that there is another way of looking at it as well, as sort of a good snapshot of the sorts of things that the staff has been identifying.
Yes, Dr. Hernandez Cortez.
Thank you so much. I think that this was an excellent summary. I agree with Dr. Annenberg that perhaps the meaningful involvement piece can be more coordinated throughout the document, just so that it's more comprehensive and it's not repetitive. But other than that, I only have one comment related to the current draft. In part of in page 35, we have one recommendation in addressing how new science on interactions between stressors fit into the HHRA process. That recommendation is not necessarily added into the list of recommendations. In the list of recommendations, there is one that is related, which will be the second to last one, which is that the SAB recommends providing more detail about cumulative risk assessment and cumulative impacts. However, I think that the point of the previous comment was about the interactions and new science, which can be both a medium-term concern or not, but I think that perhaps we can modify that. I'm not sure what others think, but that was my only comment related to that part of the draft.
Are there other comments by either people assigned to charge question 5 or the larger group? Yes, Director Lowenfight.
Hopefully this is I've had this this question throughout this conversation today, and I'm not sure. It seems like this is a good place to ask it. So when we're talking about health effects or impacts on Native communities, what is the data set that you all are using to track that or to look at that?
Dr. Wu, did you want to respond to that?
Kind of, but not really. It's intersectional with it. I was having a question about the recommendation about figuring out what the baseline is and what the populations of concern are. So I think it's interrelated to Director Lowenflight's question. And so to that extent, when we're talking about health risk assessments for communities that might have disparate health, impacts, it's a very complicated problem, I find, because in our current setup of regulating air, water, and soil separately, it requires a lot of coordination, I guess is my main point. So within a community which might have air and water or multiple burdens, to try to pinpoint what the source of said exposure causing the problem is, it's like an onion in my mind, where it's like layers and layers, and you dig and you find more. So I really just ponder this question a lot, in the sense that sometimes when we find there might be, what we think is a source of a problem, and then we find it actually went in other spaces. So I think that part really does require the continuous engagement and the collaboration of multiple parties, not just the community, but the agencies and so forth. So that's where that meaningful engagement part of it, I think, really does uplift that this is a collaborative effort with agencies, communities, and I think that's my point, is continuous engagement for collaboration to address these things in a more meaningful way, so that it's not so, I think, from the past being such an extractive type of like, we're here to do X, and if X didn't solve the problem, that creates the mistrust or contributes to it. So I think that there's a way to intersect this in a more helpful way than it's currently phrased.
That I appreciate that, and it is a difficult. I wondered what the answer would be, so that's a great answer. One of the things that has been hard for me in my research is, of course, a lot of our data lies with IHS, Indian Health Services. And so that's that data is critical. We, including myself, I mean, we all go through IHS. If you live on the reservation, that's your main place where you have all your healthcare, almost 100%. If you need additional healthcare that they can't provide there, our agency, our clinic will refer you out to a larger hospital or that sort of a thing. But yet the data from that appointment that you have will come back to IHS. And so they have a full, which everybody needs, right? You know, your doctor needs a full look at who you are in terms of your health. So they have that, but it's my understanding they don't share that data. And so if you don't have that data and you are looking at impacts of Native people, let's say in an indigenous area or on a reservation, I'm wondering, how are you able to get accurate data?
I think that's where the potential for improvements are really the pathway forward. And I think that for lack of better words, Western science, where we use indicators such as hospital records and emergency room visits, it's inadequate to address particularly air pollution concerns where the pun intended space that I work in is air pollution, and to contribute, you know, the PM 2.5 exposures and these complex mixtures exposures to respiratory and other health outcomes is not answering our question. So I think that this is a good space to potentially offer some collaborative thought with Indigenous populations to include into that healthcare concern of like, you know, we're exposed in our environment, but we don't have adequate data alone. So this is where collaboration is necessary.
I'm going to make just one follow-up comment. I think that that's correct. That's a conversation. I just did a reach out to another individual that does collects data. I think that I think we have to explore that, and I think that we have to maybe have some meaningful engagement. I'm just thinking about my reservation right now as an example, not as I'm only thinking of my reservation, but of all reservations. And because there's also, of course, you know, things that impact. Somebody had said there was a situation happening, and they said, and as a result of etc. There's the thing that was happening on the reservation. Now these people have lung cancer and such and such. And I said, that's awful. So I just went and interviewed the family because they were an extended family of mine. And they also have been smoking, cigarette smoking since they were, I think, 10 years old. And now they were in their 70s. And so they've actually lived past the what is normed on us, you know, our life expectancy, and they did have lung cancer. And so it was a tragic situation. Was it as a result of the environmental impacts of, let's say, something that was happening near on their land? I don't know. But at that point, you can't just use a person, a family in that way. And I noticed that quite a bit of the things that I'm reading in literature is they're interviewing individuals on a reservation or near a reservation. And that is sometimes what we use as a data set. And so that's a big ask of this group, but I think it's a dynamic group and it's an innovative group, and something that if we can make a stronger relationship between Indian Health Services and EPA, because in the environmental justice portion of this important group, I think that knowing those statistics could really help. And so I'm not sure how that's done exactly. It's something that I'm exploring, but I'm around it all the time, and it impacts what I'm doing. And so I just wonder, when we are publishing this, are we publishing, is the data really correct? Is there a caveat there? We're saying we really don't have the data on this subset. We're saying people in this area experience these things, and we do have data, let's say, on Native people who are living somewhat close to these things. I don't know how you do that. I mean, I don't know how you do that accurately, I guess. But that's just my comment. I don't have an answer for that exactly, but thank you.
I actually would like to follow up a little bit with that, if I could. I think, to your well-made points about population sizes, and I'm not an epidemiologist either, but I work with them enough that I understand some of these problems of not having a large enough sample size to determine, much of anything in our complex exposure paradigm. So to hear some of that comment about, like, for paraphrasing your story about an individual who smokes, who's like, well, is your cancer caused by your smoking, or is it caused by your environment where your error is less than, the ideal situation? So I think that again just draws the need for that collaboration to not necessarily contribute more mistrust to communities where the answer might be, well, you smoke, so it's your fault. And I think that if there's a way, perhaps in chapter 4, which is the EJ drivers and contributors, and in this chapter 5, just as many places that we put the bullet points to highlight the issue, but then refer to certain subsets of our document where more specific examples could be made, I think that will help.
I agree. I think that and I didn't want to make the smoking the thing, but I knew that if I were to bring that up, what's going to happen? They're going to bring it right back to that smoking. It's like, okay, but still they're having effects in this way. And then it just becomes it gets too muddy to be a good data set to sort of put forth and make an argument. You can just see it in court. It's not going to go well. And so, but those are the things. And I really I feel like there's some good strategies that I've developed in working with these things that I think that I will definitely share with the group and help us move forward with that engagement, because these things are, of course, I live here. I moved home to be the scientist for the tribe, but I worry about those things every day myself, because I live right here in the heart of some things that are, of course, having environmental impact. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Lowenfeit. Dr. Annenberg?
Yeah, thank you. And going back to some of the initial things you said, Director Lowenfeit, about where are the data coming from and who are they representative of? I think there's some tendency often to try to use data that are as generalizable as possible to cover the broadest set of people. And maybe there's something that we want to say in here, and maybe it's already there or it's already in the EJ technical guidance about using as disaggregated data as possible to maintain that specificity to different population subgroups for as long as possible in the analysis, and enable that to be carried through and conclusions to be drawn. And that might be looking for other sources of data for people that are underrepresented in the national scale data sets or the traditional data sets or typical, whatever word we want to use there. And it could be maintaining, like I said, the disaggregation of the data for as long as possible in the analysis. I don't remember if we already have that in there. I'll try to skim through and look for it.
Thank you, Dr. Annenberg. Any other comments or suggestions related to charge question number 5? If not, we can move then to charge question number 6. Dr. Olmsted is the lead discussant. And I think Dr. Barakal may not be present today. In charge question number 6 says, in chapter 6 are the analytical considerations for assessing EJ concerns in the context of a regulatory action appropriately identified and discussed. Are there considerations that should be added or removed from the discussion? And Tom
Thank-
Brennan, you're not on mute again. Before Dr. Olmsted starts, thank you. Go ahead, Dr. Olmsted.
Thank you, Dr. Elian. I won't belabor all of the suggestions that we had with respect to charge question 6. I'm going to try and just be a little bit brief, and then hopefully folks have read the chapter. So most of the comments that we made in response to the charge question were about providing some additional structure to provide a more systematic, consistent set of guidelines for EJ analysis across rules, and to acknowledge best practices across the spectrum of analytical approaches that are included already in the draft guidelines, and some others that aren't yet included. And the reason we did that is we felt like it reads a little bit more like a strategy document than a structured guidance document. And in doing so, it may prompt analysts to use a wide variety of approaches and data and arrive at substantially different conclusions, even when they're using the same data and in similar regulatory context. And so there are benefits to that, right? Which would be flexibility, for particular circumstances, particular rulemakings, and so on. But I think that, if we're looking for EJ analyses that are likely to be a little bit more systematic across rules, we felt that there might be some additional structure needed. And so just a few examples of those suggestions were things like providing a list of preferred data sources for different types of analyses to ensure consistency and data quality, providing more and more detailed descriptions of specific methods for conducting EJ analyses, discussing statistical and other challenges associated with spatial data, describing approaches to addressing the ubiquitous challenges like selection bias, establishing causality in the presence of non-random exposure to pollution and other environmental harms, and so on. Establishing firm guidelines for reporting statistical significance in many different types of analyses, and then also in modeling and describing dynamic effects and many different types of uncertainty, model uncertainty, parameter uncertainty, and so on. So that's just a selection of, again, those kind of recommendations that had to do with providing more structure, more specific guidance for this kind of systematic approach across different rules. And then we had two other overarching comments. One is to repeat the same thing that Dr. Annenberg mentioned in response to charge question 5, which was to clarify the typical purpose of conducting the regulatory analysis to assess EJ concerns. Again, you would approach analysis and kind of data analysis quite differently if you're really just looking for a descriptive, kind of analysis of what's going on, versus if you're thinking about establishing causal links or doing something that's going to have a kind of firm threshold-based influence on rulemaking in some specific way. And so we thought also that probably doesn't belong in this chapter, but write something that was more upfront, and just wanted to weigh in on that same issue that's come up several times. And then finally, we had an overarching comment about ensuring we thought one of the things that makes the document particularly useful to analysts, we thought, was the provision of a lot of different examples, right, of EJ analysis. And we felt that most of those had very obvious positive qualities, but we weren't really kind of equipped to judge whether those were the best possible examples, or all of them followed best practices and represented rigorous EJ analyses, and so on. And so we just wanted to put a plug in for ensuring that the examples that are provided throughout the draft guidance do follow best practices, do represent kind of the great examples in terms of rigor, because whether or not the examples are meant to play a really instructive role on how these will actually be implemented, they will play that role, right, for folks that are really grappling without the kind of general structure that's provided, kind of in a more highly specified document, right? Folks are going to tend to follow the examples quite closely, so that's going to be important as well. And I think I'll stop there, and then hopefully others will want to weigh in as well.
Are there other members assigned to charge question 6 who would like to add any comments? Yes, Dr. Irwin.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Elian, and thank you, Dr. Olmsted, for a great summary. I don't have really anything to add other than I would just note that in the chapter we did put a lot of discussion of and hope, and I hope that we provided enough citations to the literature. I think we did a good job with that, but if EPA thinks that there's anything specific there, I would just encourage maybe a specific note on that, because I think that we did try to do a good job on that. We did not put any of that into the recommendations list, but it is in the broader chapter. So I just wanted to point that out. And then maybe also raise a question, whether, I don't know that we had really thought about the timeline aspects of the recommendations necessarily. So we might want to do a little bit more thinking there, although I think probably most of them are on the shorter timeline. But maybe there's some that we could actually break up to be more on that medium or even longer term.
This is Ari. I don't have anything to add. I thought this was really well organized, very robust, and I thought the bullets, well numerous, did capture all the points that we were trying to make.
Great, thank you, Ari. Any other general comments? No, I don't see any. I mean, I think it is helpful to have these specific recommendations and even the additional sources of information and adding any specificity to that. And even with the IHSs, even though there may be data that are not accessible, it just, this is a personal comment, it's important just to note that they're there and they exist, and the importance of having the data in order to say anything meaningful. And it's still, I can see the frustration when the data are there versus when you just don't have the data. So you're just making assumptions. So that this seems like the bullets seem to touch on a lot of those issues. No other comments? If none, we can move on then to the last charge, question 7, I should say. And just quickly, Dr. Shalal, is Dr. Hernandez Ruiz is not here today, is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, she is not able to make it today.
So I just wanted to, and Ms. Fritz is also not here. So there are two members who were assigned this charge question. So encourage you to speak up. So charge question number 7. For chapter 7, what do you see as the key methodological or data gaps when analyzing the impacts of regulatory actions on communities with EJ concerns? Which of these gaps do you think should be prioritized in the near or longer term to improve how EPA analyzes EJ impacts of regulatory actions? Would somebody like to start?
I mean, I can start us off. I think this chapter was probably the chapter where we were writing, had more the kind of longer term view in mind. So I think a lot of what we wrote was with respect to with that in mind. I think we did try to address the data gaps and methodological gaps in a way that does hopefully align with, kind of some of the indicating timing, things that are more immediate, and then again, kind of reflecting on some of the more recent literature, things that, are not doable now, but that could be implemented or accounted for in the future as either methodologies or data become more available. So I think that was kind of our approach in terms of how we wrote that. And then we also, in this section, included, I don't know if the panel remembers, but we had kind of a long discussion at one of our sessions about kind of the roadmap of EJ analysis and kind of the different entry points for community engagement and decision making. So we had a figure that we included here that is kind of meant to indicate the multiple entry points for community engagement, and then also kind of indicating based on the type of data that's available, whether it's spatial or non-spatial, would determine, the kinds of impacts and the distributions of those impacts that are possible to analyze. And then, of course, the scale, if it is spatial data, the scale of that data, whether it's finer scale, individual or very disaggregate scale data, or whether it's only coarser data, county level or above, something like that. So hopefully that figure is meaningful and helpful, but that was also, we saw that as also part of the charge, answering part of the charge for the chapter. I guess one thing I would also note is in the list of recommendations, some of these are really, I think, more immediate in terms of providing definitions, for example, for some of the terms that are used for example, extrinsic, intrinsic, chemical, non-chemical factors, and other kinds of definitional types of things. That's an easy short-term thing, but then there some of these, I think, that are, probably more longer term. So I think that is potentially one thing that we could do with those recommendations, is break those out more clearly.
Great, thank you, Dr. Irwin. Dr. Annenberg, go ahead.
I wasn't part of this writing team, so I don't know if anyone from the writing team wants to comment before I ask a question. Okay, maybe hearing none, I'll just ask it. I was wondering whether the discussion we were having on charge question 5 related to the Indian Health Service and underrepresented groups in some of the national scale data sets that are commonly used, or other data sets that are commonly used, if that would actually be better placed in the response to this charge question on data gaps. And then I was scrolling through the response and wondered whether the response feels a little skewed towards exposure, which is obviously important, but maybe is a little bit lighter on health and demographic data. And I wonder whether we want to beef that up a little, given that there are still limitations in those types of data as well when it comes to EJ analysis.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. And if you have specifics there, I would say that would be great to, I don't disagree with you in terms of the, did come across more focused on the exposure stuff. In terms of placement of the other data gaps that we were talking about as part of chapter 5, was that it? Chapter 5? I would leave that up to you. If it feels like it fits better here, then absolutely, let's do that.
Yes, Dr. Chakraborty, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a comment that's kind of along the same lines, because I was just thinking that one of the things we discussed and added in our response to charge question number 1 was the over-reliance on US Census or American Community Survey data and the need to look beyond ACS data and look at other data sets that provide a better sense of like daytime exposures and demographic ones, I guess, is what I'm referring to. So I was wondering, I really like how, sorry, I didn't get to read the response to Char's question 7 before today, but I like how it's organized and there's a separate section on data gaps, right? And that's where some of that can be emphasized a little bit. Again, going back to my comment earlier today that we don't want to go into specifics in response to Char's question number 1, just because other questions are raised, maybe just refer to that. And this is where, and again, going back to the comments we received earlier today in the PowerPoint presentation, I think one of those bullets focus on adding references and suggested data sets. So maybe that, I'm thinking that may be better suited for data gaps here. And we won't need to get into that for Char's question number 1. But depending on what others, I guess, who contributed to question 1 feel about it, or 7. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. Dr. Wu, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this chapter again begs that question of repeating for the sake of making a point about how dynamic the situations are, to the point made about the demographic shifts and trying to understand exposure. That's going to be, I think, a perpetual problem as different communities clearly are somewhat, for lack of better words, migratory. And I think about in California, the example of agricultural workers and the multiple exposures that they have. And so to try to capture who and where and to some of the language in the earlier part of chapter 7, talking about a little bit exposome type stuff, that in and of itself, and the machine learning and all of these, newer methodologies that aren't yet ready to do what we hope it can do. I think this chapter really begs that question of, let's tier this as the population shifts are, I think, something we can do with better relationships and more granular relationships in communities, and then tiering that with the advancement of technologies as it comes with exposure assessments, meaning I'm aware of, for example, silicone wristbands being able to detect kind of exposures of populations that wear these wristbands, not specific chemicals, but, groups of chemicals, pesticides, for example. And then so as science advances and is able to do high throughput analysis, and then, hopefully combine that with understanding the who, I think that this can be tiered. And so I think this can be fleshed out better with what we were talking about, the bullet points for recommendation, short-term, long-term, medium-term kind of things, and then build on that. Thank you.
Dr. Abel, go ahead.
Yeah, this was addressed in other sections, and to me, one of the big data gaps is air monitoring. There's a lot in this about the new satellite data that's coming online, but good ground level data monitors are important for ground truthing that whole new data set. But generally, in a new proposed appendix, we talked about the real problems with the National Air Quality Monitoring System, and especially even worse, the National Air Toxic Trends System. Both of those monitoring systems just simply are inadequate. And this came up also when we started the conversation about the self-initiated review. So I think there's some distinction that we want to maybe talk about between this chapter and the self-initiated review for the longer term, I guess. But to me, I think the lack of air monitoring data is a really big hole that probably deserves another mention in this section. So I don't know how the members of this charge question feel about that, but that would be my recommendation, and that would be have some redundancy, but I think it's a good kind of redundancy.
Thank you, Dr. Abel. Dr. Anuro, go ahead.
I was going to add in the discussion and also looking through the document, the data gap, of course, it's on the capturing those rural and some of the communities that are not captured by the national monitoring systems. But also the indigenous, I think Dr. Longfine also mentioned that part of that huge community of the indigenous tribes are also part of that data gap. And one way that could be bridged is incorporating those mobile monitoring air monitoring units, but also checking with the national data set to make sure that it's accurate. But one of the impacts of those mobile monitoring units is that it does have a huge impact on the rural and local communities because it can help them make immediate decisions on air quality and other pollution-related issues. And that's where some of the gaps that were mentioned during the discussion, and I think it was also included in the comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Noro. Other comments related to the charge question number 7?
Dr. Elian, our lead writer isn't here, so I don't know how we want to proceed, but I mean, I would just encourage anyone who had Dr. Annenberg and Chakraborty and Abel and others who have ideas about what's missing in terms of data gaps to please, and Dr. Onuro, please send a short paragraph or just, a couple of sentences. And if there's a reference to any references to pilot data or or in the literature to include those as well, and that would help us then, I think, flesh those out in the chapter.
And just to add to that, I mean, and some that also relates to any of the charge questions. It would be super helpful to those individuals in the lead discussants to have the input of exactly what Dr. Owen was talking about, the references, specific data sets, or just to add more specificity. So I know it's a lot to ask when people are doing so much and focusing on their own charge questions. And the other thing I would think would be helpful for me, just in thinking about it, is going through each charge question and looking at the bullets for the recommendations and seeing really, is that the most impactful, besides tiering, which I think the organization, each charge question, it is helpful to have it the same organization and structure. If there's overlap or slightly different recommendations, but which might obfuscate maybe the importance of what combined what that we're trying to say as a panel or make a recommendation. So encourage people really, if they would do exactly what Dr. Irwin suggested, and looking at the document as a whole is also very helpful, because Dr. Shalal and I are doing that, but it is different people's writing and different thoughts, and so it would really benefit from others assisting with that as well. Other comments for charge question number 7? And again, a few people were not able to come today, and even though they did send some comments, I know ones which were shared, I think, with the document, there may be some additional comments coming, so that will also be helpful from those individuals. So overall, Dr. Shaw, you can certainly interject where time-wise I don't hear other if there's any comments at all, just in terms of not only the specific charge questions, but the process in general, the document in general, people should feel free to share.
Well, I would like to actually invite folks to take a look at the letter to the administrator and think about, maybe have a short discussion today about whether or not you feel the recommendations that are included in that upfront letter were the right ones. Is that what the panel basically wants to convey in a sort of overarching way to the administrator and to those who are possibly just simply reading that letter and not necessarily reading the entire report? Are these really the major points that you want to get across? And have we left anything out? And would you suggest anything be added or removed from that list that's currently there? So if we could take a few minutes to think about that. And for those individuals that were not, excuse me, able to join us during today's meeting, that's the reason why we left a little bit of time up front during the July 30th meeting next week, when folks can revisit some of this, stuff that may have they haven't had a chance to actually weigh in, or if somebody thought of something, in the interim and they'd like to add it, we have that opportunity to do that on the 30th as well. So I think if we could take just a few minutes to think about the letter, and then we can discuss sort of a little bit more of the logistics about how we're going to implement everything.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw. Yeah, so really the letter is just the 2 pages, and the idea is to kind of keep it brief. But to Dr. Shalaw's point, it's also to have those bullets really reflect what's the most important pieces of the whole report, bringing them up front, as Dr. Abel has suggested. So people could just take a few minutes to read that if they haven't had the chance. Dr. Annenberg, go ahead.
Regarding the second point on meaningful engagement, this one reads to me like a comment I might make on the meaningful engagement document that EPA is developing in parallel. It's a broad recommendation about meaningful engagement, and I wonder if we want to make it a little bit more specific to technical analyses, how meaningful engagement can be harnessed, leveraged, applied. I don't know the right term, but how the 2 processes engage as opposed to just strengthening meaningful engagement.
Dr. Abel and then Ms. Lewis.
Yeah, I'll try to address Dr. Annenberg's question. I think for the meaningful engagement, we probably want to consider adding language about how equal access doesn't ensure meaningful engagement. And then not just working directly and more closely with affected communities, but a lot of participatory, public participatory research emphasizes, and I think it's captured elsewhere in this document that we can pull out, is that EPA needs to have more resources invested, granted to communities so that they can substantively participate in even technical decision-making processes. So, you know, we could be looking at another line for this bullet point, maybe a second statement, but I know we probably want to keep these at a really high level. These are the bullet points that the administrator will see, and so that's my first question, or my response to Dr. Annenberg, and I hope I addressed your question, Dr. Annenberg, in a way. And then I'm thinking about the chapter that we just went through. I think there are things presented in the response that could be highlighted in a bullet point that would essentially reflect a high-level summary of the big data gaps identified in chapter 7. So one of those would be the air monitoring data gaps, but I think we also have plenty of evidence that there are big water quality gaps that are certainly relevant to environmental justice. We depend on the states to assess waters, to test waters for certain parameters, and many of the states, you know, their assessments, they've only assessed less than half of their waters in their state. So that could be a bullet worth adding there, combining air and water quality data gaps. And I don't know if there's, you know, the Indian Health Services epidemiological data gap that deserves creating a bullet here. I certainly would like to see a bullet that reflects, I think, our conversation today and Director Lonefights challenge in a way to us about really an indigenous knowledge science panel creation that would kind of parallel the structure of this very science review panel. That's something that the agency probably should invest in. So that would be 2 additional bullets that I would think about. And I think other members might have other bullets. This is the high level stuff that you go through with an administrator. And, you know, this is kind of the 2-minute elevator speech. What would you tell the EPA administrator needs to change? So that's one way I've thought about this part of the response.
Thank you, Dr. Abel. Ms. Lewis, all right, go ahead.
Yeah, I think a concept that I know I mentioned a few times, and then because I was sort of attuned to it, saw it mentioned many, many more times throughout the document, which is this idea of it being a little bit more of a structured guidance, having it move more from a strategy document to a bit more of a framework. I don't want to say step by step, but just something a little bit more structured, like clear directions on next steps, and even getting into, you know, data sources, and if the data sources are deficient, that kind of, you know, moves us into other, you know, what Dr. Abel was just saying, you know, kind of identifying where there are holes in the kind of data that you actually do need to do these kind of assessments.
Great. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Annenberg.
guess one other idea, and I'm not sure how these bullets were selected, but the concepts that keep coming up over and over again, the areas where it was observed that there's some overlap. I wonder if that's because the committee sees their importance throughout the process of EJ analyses. And I wonder if those are meaningful in terms of what should be pulled out as top line messages. The meaningful engagement was one of them. Off the top of my head, the defining of the objective was another one. I can't remember what the others were, but maybe I'm just advocating for adding something about defining the objective, but maybe it's also, if we go back and look at all those areas of overlap, what were some of the themes that each writing team for each charge question brought forward in their response?
Yes, Dr. Hernandez Cortez, go ahead.
I think that I agree with what has been said. The only thing that I would add is the measure of cumulative impacts. I think that throughout the recommendations and the document, we mentioned that several times. Perhaps adding it in the fourth point, where we established the importance of selecting and examining the populations of concerns. To identify baseline EJ concerns, perhaps there is a good place to add the calculation of cumulative impacts and the potential interactions between pollutants.
Other comments? Yes, Director Lonefight.
I just want to thank everybody for your comments. It's always wonderful to be heard in a different way, because this is certainly not on my behalf per se. And I know our communities are doing fabulous in so many ways. Cultural revitalization, language revitalization. But the things that we were talking about in this group could definitely affect all of those things. And so I just really want to say thank you to everybody. I just appreciate your work, appreciate being a part of the conversation. And I think this is monumental. We haven't quite had a Indigenous woman a part of these conversations in this way. And I just want to, again, thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Director Lonefight. Sort of continuing the thought about this 2-page, because in some ways it really is probably what will stick out. I might encourage people who have made suggestions, if you provide those to either incorporated to Dr. Shalal and me, just but we really want to, I think, capture, I think a bit to Dr. Nannenberg's point, we certainly in our discussions have touched on some topics pretty regularly. And I think they are incorporated, the meaningful engagement is a bullet, and even maybe reorganizing and maybe some rewording of these bullets also would be useful. Some are broader and others are more specific to the technical side of the question if you're talking about what the calculations are, sort of the data quality and data gaps. And so maybe organizing them in a little bit to those kind of groups might help. But I do want to encourage people to think about these 2 pages a little bit more. We have time. now additional 10, 15 minutes to, you know, continue this discussion. I think it's really an important part of the document. Yeah, Dr. Abel.
Yeah, so I'm going back to Dr. Wolverton's guidance, and this has come up several times on whether or not we want to maybe even organize these bulleted points into near-term recommendations and long-term recommendations.
Yes, Dr. Wu.
Yeah, I would agree with that, particularly as I see bullet 2 about meaningful engagement and point 3 about leveraging state and local staff to improve outreach. I think that those two are related. And so the collaboration and partnerships of the US EPA regions with states as they can help build the relationships that are necessary for informing policy, and you know, that kind of feedback loop that I think about for the regional staff to inform the federal staff and the state staff to help, you know, inform the regional staff, that kind of continuum is necessary. And I think it will definitely help in terms of what can be done in the short term and then feed into the longer term.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. Any other comments? Hearing none, we have the agenda, thinking about next steps in this process, and Dr. Schlall can also add her thoughts about this. But again, I encourage everybody, even if it's not the charge question to which you were assigned, to provide any information you can to assist the lead discussants and the members of the charge question group. Really encourage people to try to read through the entire document, particularly the recommendations from each charge question, making sure that it's really inconsistencies. I see more concern about inconsistencies. Sometimes redundancies can demonstrate that those are important points to the group, and it might, as long as it addresses the charge question that it's that redundancy is related to. And I think people have identified areas where they saw that they could remove some material or move it from 5 to 3 or whatever it might be. And also recognizing that charge question 1, as Dr. Chakraborty was saying, is more an overall view. So it might have more generic statements, but then the more specific detail related to that point would be in a specific charge question later on. We have opportunity on Tuesday, July 30th to continue deliberations, especially if there's other things that have come up, other written comments that have come up, and then move on to the commentary. I really encourage people to read that. It's a much shorter document, but I think it does reflect, since it's a self-initiated project, what this group feels is really important to say on a broader context about EJ analyses and not specifically to the charge questions. And any overlap between that commentary and the report is fine. They're independent, or not independent documents, but they're two separate things that we're providing, and they're very different in how they're structured. So Sue, Dr. Schlall, do you want to add anything about maybe the next steps that you see and any other information?
Yes, so I think also what I'd like to hear is Dr. Abel on several occasions suggested that we reformat the report so that we list sort of the major topics that we intend to discuss within the response to a particular charge question, i.e. putting the recommendations first and then elaborating further as we go into the response. I'd like to hear a little bit about whether others agree with that suggestion going forward, so that it gives a little bit of insight to lead discussants as to how to restructure their responses going forward. So that's one issue that I would like to resolve. Another is I'd like to ask, I think we're going to do this in a sort of stepwise fashion, where I'd like individuals to send their comments on any charge question that they wish, beyond whatever they were assigned to. Give those comments back to me and the lead discussant by, I'm suggesting August 5th, because we'll be meeting next week to finish up this discussion, both on the draft report as well as the commentary. So the following week, Monday of that week, would be August 5th. So if we could get everybody's comments about how to change, edit the responses, or add to a particular response, or if they have references they want to add, or any of those ideas to be sent in by August 5th. And then I'd like to have the lead discussants then use that information and revise their draft response to their particular charge question by that following week, which is August 12th. So by August 12th, we'll have the new version of the response, and then folks can go in and make any additional edits that they feel are still needed once they see that new draft written. So we'll have another week after that, which would bring us to August 19th, by which time panel members can see the new draft of the response and provide any additional edits that they want. So I'm hoping by the week of the 19th, that is Monday, everybody's done with their adding their edits. And I will obviously be in on or seeing this move forward. So by the end of that week, I will then have those new responses done with all the edits added. And then we can proceed to creating our final draft that we will be then transmitting to the administrator. And before I do that, I will send out a final version of the entire report and the commentary to get concurrence from everyone that they are comfortable with what is being transmitted for review and approval by the chartered SAB. And I believe that they will be having a meeting probably in October to review the report and finalize it with the chartered body. But we would have to have it obviously available to them at least 30 days in advance so that they can have a chance to read and comment on the draft report and the commentary. So anybody have any questions? Janae, Dr. Smith? You're on mute.
Thank you. So I just wanted to clarify. So we're each doing individual comments based on what we saw today. I'm wondering, is it possible for us, I don't know if this is appropriate, for us, even the ones who have the same charge question, like if we could comment on an online document or something, so like I can see as other people put things on and I might comment on it then, or is that not allowed? For me, I don't know how others feel about that, and I guess that's a question also, but for me, it's helpful because I can see people as they make changes and I can comment on different things then, but I don't know whether that's appropriate or.
Well, what I wanted to do was to allow the lead discussants to revise their draft responses before people go in and start making their edits. So in order for them to do that, they need all the information that's been discussed here today. Any new thoughts and ideas that folks put out, or any new references that you want to add in, or, any of the discussion that we had today about rewording or changing things up from the current draft. I'd like them to have the benefit of having that information in order to be able to provide a new draft that everybody can weigh in on. And yes, you will have that opportunity where you'll see other people's comments, which would happen, I guess, after the 12th of August, when the new drafts are provided by the lead discussants. Then it will be open to everyone to, just make any changes that they want, seeing what other people are also adding or deleting.
And just quickly, the SIB meeting has been scheduled, and that's for the October, I think the 15th and the 16th. So Dr. Shaw, just for your information.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it will not be confirmed until, I guess, when it's confirmed.
Okay.
When it becomes more public.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, sorry about that. Dr. Saad, go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Shalal, will you be providing, sending us a timeline with all those dates so we can keep that straight? I'm sure you will. And
yes.
Also, could we be provided a copy of Dr. Wolverton's PowerPoint that she spoke from today? Because that had some specific things to address by EPA or any sort of guidance from EPA staff who've read the report and had some guidance for lead discussants to rewrite. That would be very helpful.
Yes, and I think I may have sent it, but maybe not. If not, all of this information, everything, including the NYU comments, anything that's related to our meetings is always on the website. So you always have access to it, by going to the link that I provide in I think all of my emails to you guys. So, and each meeting has its own information associated with it. So an agenda for a specific meeting is going to be on that meeting's webpage. So for today, whatever presentations happen today, all of those are on the meeting webpage for today. But I'll be happy to resend that to everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. And along with that, as you suggested, I'll provide the timeline that I am proposing, as well as the email addresses for the specific lead discussants for each of the charge questions. But as a reminder, whenever you send something out to anyone, you should also include me. I don't know if Dr. Elian wants to receive all those emails, but you can also, include her if you wish, but you definitely need to include me in any correspondence you have with your fellow panel members. And we'll be meeting again. I mean, this meeting is technically not over until July 30th, after we complete the discussion on Tuesday. And then at that time, I will, share with you the email that will have all these dates associated with the different steps that we would like to take in order to complete this draft report. Anybody else have questions?
And I don't know if Dr. Wolverton, if you'd like to say anything before we convene the meeting, before Dr. Shalal convenes the meeting.
Just thank you very much for your continued diligence and thoughtfulness on producing a really high quality draft report. We really appreciate it. I think there was a specific request earlier, maybe from Dr. Abel, for places where there might be overlap specific to one of the chapters. Sorry, it's all sort of merging, but I did send that to Sue in real time after that, so I wouldn't forget. So that's something else that can be circulated. It's specific to that ask and that specific charge, but I think it was charge question 3, maybe.
And then you were going to also provide me with the link to the document that the new report that was out,
right?
As well as the docket.
The draft meaningful involvement policy as that was posted to the docket, which would have been in November, December of 2023. And it was out for 60 days of public comment. It's under revision now, but that's at least the public version of that that's available.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else anybody would like to add? Questions, logistics?
Okay, so I guess Dr. Elian, do you have anything else before we recess?
I do not, and yes, that's right, it's a recess because this meeting will just continue in several days. So no, I have nothing else to add, just to thank everybody for their contributions and input and getting this document into better and better shape.
Yes, thank you so much to everyone. And so I look forward to our meeting on July 30th. Same information for logging on to our meeting on the 30th as you used for this meeting today. And same time, 1 p.m. Eastern time to 5 p.m. Eastern time is our meeting times for next week. And maybe one piece of homework that I'd like to give to folks is to think about the letter to the administrator and think about what that 2-minute elevator speech should include. That would be something that we could do in the meantime. So with that, I will recess the meeting until